Good evening, and we are here to reconvene the February meeting of the Lawrence Douglas County Planning Commission. And we will start that with some discussion of communications. We need to receive some written communications. Is that correct, Scott?
There are no written communications that I'm aware of.
There was an email. Should I just cover that under ex parte?
Yes, if there was any email received after the deadline, that would be
Okay.
ex parte.
All righty. So no written communications from staff, planning commissioners, or other commissioners. So under disclosure of ex parte communications, I did have a brief conversation with Penny Van Auken about the comprehensive plan, and it reflected comments that she made at the meeting on Monday. I also had a short conversation with Tanya Voigt from Zoning and Codes about item number 8, the text amendment to the subdivision residential regulations for residential parcels, and then she sent an email that was also copied to staff.
Yeah, and I think when that item comes up, you may want to share a little more fully what the email message was in that.
I will do
Or
that.
we could, at your direction.
Okay, I didn't print it, but
Okay,
if we,
okay, we can do that.
all righty, we'll wait for that item to come up. And with that, we are moving some items from the printed agenda, and I,
Excuse me, Madam Chair, I also wanted to declare
Oh,
ex
I'm
parte
sorry.
communication.
Go ahead.
Forgive me, the reason I was risking a late start was I received an email just a couple of hours ago that I forwarded to staff from my sister-in-law, who is a neighbor of the petition on item 5, expressing her opposition to that item. And I
Okay.
can disclose the details during the discussion, but yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for mentioning that. And I had 2 more items. Do we have any declarations of abstentions from specific agenda items? I assume you are not abstaining?
I'm not abstaining.
Okay. Any other abstentions? And any general public comment? This is the time when we open it up to public comment that is outside of our regular agenda items. If any member of the public would like to address us on a topic outside of our agenda, they're welcome to at this time to take 3 minutes to address us on any subject. Is anyone here for that? All right. So with that,
Madam Chair, excuse me.
Yes.
I do want to disclose one ex parte communications, and I brought it up on Monday, but I should mention again that I had a conversation with City Commissioner Stuart Boley on Friday night. He just wanted to clarify his position on the non-owner occupied short-term rental issue. I brought that up to Scott the other night, and I assume there's some clarity impending for that?
Yeah, and I think I'm going to speak to you, Commission, a little bit on our first short-term rental that may clarify that a little bit.
okay, so we'll get the update on that with the first short-term rental item. Okay, thank you. Any other ex parte communications? So with that, we're actually moving item 2, which is the comprehensive plan discussion of the Environment and Natural Resources chapter, to the end of the meeting. So we'll start with item number 3, which is a special use permit for short-term rental at 1500 Rhode Island.
Madam Chair, while we're getting ready to present this, I'll speak to Commissioner Struckoff's issue. So last month at the Planning Commission, before we looked at a specific item, Becky Pepper kind of laid the groundwork for this seemingly unique land use, right? The short-term rental land use. And you're bound to see many of these this first year as it comes forward. And one of the things, as you know, this program was created with an owner-occupied and a non-owner-occupied use. And the owner-occupied use requires licensing and inspection by our staff. And the non-owner-occupied use, which is you don't live there, but you manage it from a different home, either in the city or away from the city, requires a special use permit. And as we approached this use in templates for staff reports and how we might approach it as staff, we thought it important to highlight that one of the things related to this use is its transient nature. And by that I mean very narrowly that people who occupy these homes on a temporary basis are transient, much like a hotel or a bed and breakfast. use, and that is sort of built into the program. So every one of these will be transient in nature, and that really shouldn't be an element that is used against an application coming forward, because they all share that element. After last month's meeting and the recommendations that you made, which have either gone to the commission on consent as approval or are going next week on the regular item, because we have a protest petition on one of them. But without getting into details of specific cases, Commissioner Boley did approach me with a little bit of concern, at least on how staff had presented that to the Planning Commission, because we had a paragraph in our staff report that talked about that transient nature and that it shouldn't necessarily be held against an application. So while I still believe that to be the case, I think that that some could interpret that paragraph to tilt the scale toward short-term rentals, and that our goal is to approve them all or give the benefit of the doubt to short-term rentals as they come through. The fact is that it's a special use permit request like any special use permit request, and all of our criteria, the golden criteria, the special use permit criteria, should be considered. In particular, I think there was some concern when some elements of some specific requests last month were brought up to the Planning Commission, and a full discussion may not have been had with it. So I would encourage you that when presented with testimony from the public or knowledge you might have as you go out and look at these in the field, that you discuss those issues, analyze them, consider them, and then you'll have to make judgment calls on whether it's unique to, excuse me, for my cold, 'tis the season. And then decide whether it's out of the norm for a special use permit in any given area. And I think what you'll find is that you'll have as many unique situations as you have unique neighborhoods. And so that we need to review these things in the context of those neighborhoods. But, and we're happy to help with that as you seek these things. So things such as traffic and the scope and scale of the house that's being requested, and the street design perhaps, and a lot of different things that can go into any special use permit need to be fully discussed, and that's what helps the governing body the most as they get these items sent up to them. So I hope I'm clarifying and not muddying the waters, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you. We may have some.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Becky Pepper with the Planning Department. The request for you tonight is for a owner-occupied short-term rental located at 1500 Rhode Island Street, which is located in the southeast corner of Rhode Island Street and 15th Street. It's located within the boundaries of the Barker neighborhood. It is also adjacent to the East Lawrence neighborhood. And then the Oread neighborhood is located further to the west on the west side of Massachusetts Street. The subject property is zoned RS5, single dwelling residential. It contains a detached dwelling use. It is surrounded by RS5 zoning and other single family residential uses to the east, west, and south. Immediately to the north is Central Middle School. And then other non-residential uses within the area. Here over to the east is the Sunrise Project, which was the former Sunrise Nursery. And then at the corner of New Hampshire Street and 15th Street, there is the vintage Lawrence Church, which was the previous Lawrence Community Theater location. As I mentioned, the property contains a detached dwelling. It also meets the parking requirement for that detached dwelling use. It contains 2 off-street parking spaces which take access from 15th Street. And this request is for the use of 2 guest rooms associated with a non-owner occupied short-term rental use. And the parking requirement for that short-term rental use is 1 parking space per guest bedroom. So the 2 existing parking spaces would meet that requirement. To reiterate, the property contains a detached dwelling. It is zoned RS5. The maximum occupancy limit permitted in that RS5 zoning district is a maximum of 3 unrelated occupants per dwelling unit. It has a existing off-street parking of 2 spaces, and the existing and proposed guest rooms are 2. So the request aligns with the maximum occupancy limit of the zoning district and meets the parking requirement. So with the findings that are found in the staff report, based on the findings in the staff report, staff recommends approval of the special use permit located at 1500 Rhode Island Street and forwarding the request to the City Commission with subject to the following conditions: that the occupancy limit not exceed 3 unrelated occupants per dwelling unit, that the maximum number of guest rooms available to rent not exceed 2 guest rooms, that the dwelling unit remain residential in appearance and characteristic, and that the short-term rental license is obtained annually from the Planning and Development Services Department. With that, I will stand for any questions.
Thank you. And is the applicant here?
Barbara Jones with the Jones Group LLC, and I don't have anything further to add.
I'm sorry?
I have nothing further to add.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any members of the public who would like to speak on this item? So seeing none, we will bring it back up to the commission for discussion in a new and different way than how we did last time. I do have a quick question, Becky. So there's a detached dwelling, but the use that we're looking at is actually for the main dwelling or for the detached dwelling?
The detached dwelling is the main, so the property contains a single-family residence.
Okay, I thought it had,
The technical land use term is detached.
okay. I thought it had an accessory dwelling
No,
with it in
this
that
is
other
for the
garage.
main structure.
Okay,
Just a
thank
garage.
you. Got it.
I have a question for staff, Madam Chair.
Go ahead.
So with the guidance from the city commission then, Scott, are we going to start seeing staff's assessment of the golden criteria on these specific SUPs?
Well, our report won't change very much. You'll see the criteria listed. We had some specific criteria for special use permits that we use,
Right.
but, so no, I don't think you'll see different criteria being used. I just wanted to clarify the point that our intent wasn't to tip the scales toward the industry on this. Neighborhoods are gonna have very valid very valid issues that they bring up, and we shouldn't discount those for the sake of the fact that the program was adopted. I think what you'll find is many of them will be fairly similar in their context. And I can just share with you that what we are looking for as staff are those homes and maybe those areas where the context is a little bit atypical. And so you've got a large house, or maybe there is or, you know, one of the things I know we're going to confront eventually is a street being sort of overtaken with these? Or at what level are there too many in a neighborhood? We don't have criteria for that necessarily, but I think that's going to be an evolution of the discussion, so, as an example.
In
Commissioner
that
Carpenter.
line, is it possible for staff to pull up the rental licensing map, the interactive map?
We have the long-term map that we can do. We're working on a short-term map.
Well, I was just asking if you pull up the long-term map,
Yeah.
because I think part of taking what you just told us is some new directions. We're bringing the character of the neighborhood as an issue that we should probably discuss, so I did look at them today, which, before I talk about them, I'd like to
Sure.
put the map up.
And I think over time, the planning commission is going to have to create a portfolio of what's normal, what's typical, right? In terms of, so that when you do see, like you do with every other special use permit request, you're sitting here and through experience, you know what compatibility with the neighborhood looks like and adjacent zoning reviews and those sorts of things. And the reason we're talking about this is because this is a sort of a new use and it's a little bit unique in that there will be so many of them that come through. It's very similar to some of the other uses we have, like bed and breakfast or a home occupation, in terms of its impact from a zoning perspective. And some of those are ministerial in nature, and some of those require a special use permit. But this is the one use that you'll probably see more than any of those others because of how we've built the program that requires it to go through that special use permit process.
Would you pull up the area just south of Central Middle School? Yeah, there we go. I get zoom in a little bit just on the couple of blocks there. Because, when I was looking at this today, some of the neighborhoods have had issues in the past with the number of units that have turned into rentals. And the short-term rentals are making some properties more attractive to purchase and convert because you can generate increased income by the daily rental rates over a monthly rental. So that's going to put more pressure on the housing stock in some of the neighborhoods. So I did look at this just to kind of get in my head what it was looking like in this area. And this street, I think, had this particular block, the 1500 block, has 2 rentals on it now, and the rest of it's still single-family owner occupied, as this house was until it was purchased and converted to the bed and breakfast. And it's not currently being used as a rental, licensed rental property. It's just been single-family used for short-term rentals. So I don't know where I want to go with that, except that if you look just to the east, you'll see, like in the Oriad neighborhood, huge swaths that it's nothing but rentals. Centennial is the same, which just dropped into CDGB funding neighborhood. It was the only neighborhood in the city that dropped and went into that category. Several came out, but so I just wanted that. Perhaps each time when we discuss these, we can kind of use this map until we have the actual short-term rental to get an idea of what's happening with properties, especially as the discussions of affordable housing are going to really heat up, because these are also taking properties out of that potential pool. That being said, looking at this particular property and its location, and knowing what it looked like over the years since I drive by it almost every other day or every day, it certainly is one of the most kept houses on the street. And I certainly appreciate the inclusion of the renters' reviews as part of the packet. I think if this is one that's already an Airbnb, that would be helpful for us to see. And the thing that really struck me was under the policies that are part of that is that the owner's already listing the occupancy restriction right there on Airbnb. And I think that's a big plus. I mean, I think this one's, I'm fine. I'm going to vote in favor of it, but I'm just kind of using this as a general discussion of types of items that we might consider to meet this criteria, to examine its appropriateness for the neighborhood. If it was, I don't know when it's going to strike me that for a place that we have, it's not right, but if we're going to examine the overall context, I think it's going to be helpful to just have an idea of what the property uses in the neighborhoods are, since these are primarily going to be in them more attractive neighborhoods for downtown and everything else. But with all that being said, I think this one looks good, and I would be in favor of the special use permit.
Commissioner Struckoff?
I like that. I also appreciate the review matter and information that was included in the application. And I think Commissioner Carpenter makes a good point. I wonder if there are Airbnbs that are not registered right now, that are simply running through Airbnb, one of our 88 properties in the city that are Airbnbs. Is there a feedback or a mechanism that the city receives notification about issues? And do we already, so here we have a nice set of reviews and we have an Airbnb that's been in business. Can we find out whether there have been complaints about the conduct or the operation of any Airbnb in the city? What's the current mechanism for that? And can we refer to that in because not every application might have these wonderful reviews and information. Also, they may not already be an Airbnb. They may be a property that has not yet been used and therefore would not have any reviews or history of enforcement or complaints.
I think that would have to be submitted to us as a complaint. There are multiple platforms that do this, that facilitate this sort of use. I think what you saw was voluntary information presented because it benefited the application. I think you could find testimony to the contrary on an application because it's out there, right? And I think that may be one of the items that you can consider if that testimony were given to you. But our codes aren't seeking that information necessarily, although it may be a specific site context that you want to consider.
And my question is more to whether the city has an official gathering or reporting.
Just through our typical code enforcement
Okay, so there's no Airbnb specific mechanism
No,
currently.
I will just share with you there, it's gotten kind of sophisticated. They don't anymore put their address up there where you can go right to it. We don't know where they are.
Yeah.
Even if we were to get on Airbnb or other places and explore, they're getting savvy enough to put interior shots, no longer even exterior shots. So we don't really know. And when you map them, they're not on the map of the address. They're within a perimeter around it. So many companies are popping up to help cities enforce and find the specific addresses and locations and owners because that's how they're doing it.
Thanks, Scott. I appreciate Commissioner Carpenter's reference to this map. I've driven past that house. It's down at the other end of my block, a few blocks, many times, and it is one of the best kept houses on that block. And that doesn't always, that's a good thing, but that doesn't mean it's suitable every time just because a place looks good. The size or other context that the house exists in might be not suitable for any variety of reasons. I'm inclined to support this one, and I do like the idea of using the map and as establishing kind of a baseline of what we expect. I think we've done a good job in telling applicants of all types kind of what the Planning Commission will expect from an application. And I think this way of doing this diligence and building this kind of baseline expectation is probably good. I appreciate the information that's included in the application. I hope that is something we can kind of encourage people to submit along with their.
Commissioner Sinclair?
I have a comment and a question. A comment in this, I don't think has any bearing on the outcome, but just for purposes of having a clean record, the site plan aerial picture in the packet, I think is of a different property. I don't know if that matters. It looks like it's on New Hampshire Street. I'm not sure if the applicant submitted that or someone else.
No, thank you for that.
And then the second question I had, I think probably is for Becky. The conditions on the approval are all included in the Land Development Code or the City Code. What does including them as conditions of approval for the SUP add, I guess, if they're already required by code?
Yeah, we talked about that. We just wanted to highlight them because having conditions helps our enforcement if they're not met, in our opinion. So it's just, we don't normally, you're right, we don't normally recite code as conditions, but we want to make sure that the applicant knows that these are important parts of the code and their conditions of their special use permit, because these are the conditions that we can use if they're not being met to revoke the special use permit.
Thank you.
And Commissioner, I was looking, yeah, throughout the staff report, I believe we have the right graphics, but
Yeah.
perhaps that page map isn't the right one.
Yeah, thank you for, I'll get that corrected before city commission. Thank you for bringing that to my attention.
So certainly in the way that, or in the framework that we evaluated the previous ones from last month, the previous special use permits for short-term rental, this covers all of the criteria that I was looking for previously. We're just kind of trying to feel our way back into how do we better assess the neighborhood fit. And I think that's going to be hard with these first ones especially, and part of it is we know they exist already. We don't know what their impact is on our community. And the only way for us to learn what the impact on our community might be would be to know where they are and be able to monitor that. And this, to me, is that first step, is to have people come forward and get the license and run through the special use permit process, if that's the program that we have spelled out. But I think it's still fairly important to, and I fairly understand City Commission saying they don't want us to give too much weight to the industry, but I also think that that is what furthers our finding out of information about what impact these really have. Because there are concerns about whether they harm hotel uses, whether they harm affordable housing, and I think there are some legitimate concerns there, but we won't know what that impact is until we can start to put some data to it. So I'm inclined, I don't see any reason to vote against this. I'll be voting for it. And we'll kind of feel our way through the others as we go also.
Can I suggest is, when the applicant meets with staff, is it possible to find out what platforms they're advertising the house on already, and maybe give us a printout of some of the reviews?
I think we can ask for that information.
All right, they can either give it to
Encourage
you or
them.
not give it to you. and then-
Right, we could encourage that. If you find that helpful, we could integrate that into
I
the
think
application
I-
and seek that information.
This was very helpful, especially to see what the policies of the particular short-term rental is, and to see that they already had the city, limits on it was encouraging, so.
Though I would note, obviously, that didn't work its way into the program as a requirement to
Right.
put that on, so.
That's why I said it's voluntary for them to give it, but it's certainly something, if the applicant's here, we can inquire where it is and we can find it during the hearing.
I liked having that information also, and these first few that come forward, that's pretty legitimate, but if, a couple of years in, we find out we get, an application and they've been operating for 5 years and we didn't know and they didn't comply, that would be a little of a trickier request to ask for them to
I
disclose
would hope that if that happens, that staff says something about it before he ever comes to us.
Do we have any other discussion on this item? Do we have a motion? Commissioner Sands.
I'd like to recommend approval of a special use permit for the non-owner occupied short-term rental use located at 1500 Rhode Island Street, and forwarding the request to the city commission with a recommendation of approval, subject to the following conditions found in the body of this, 1 through 4, found in the body of the staff report.
Thank you. And do we have a second? Thank you. Commissioner Carter. And any further discussion?
I just want to echo some of the things that we've said already, especially about, if able, for staff to request the listing, a printout of the listing or a screenshot of the listing in the various, that might even also be a condition of reapplication. I know we're not, that's not the motion tonight, but that may be something for us to consider in the future when it's time to renew the short-term license that has already been approved, bringing those things that we've all listed out as being helpful for that decision. That may be the most appropriate time to evaluate whether or not they're providing a good service and that kind of thing.
Sorry, we have a,
May I
Comment.
clarify
Yeah.
that, Commissioner Sands? Because the special use permit, if granted,
Oh, there's no time limit on it.
would run with the land, and typically there's no time limit. They do need to be licensed annually, and again, there's no requirement there's nothing they need to prove to staff to get that license except meet the licensing requirements. So, just for your consideration.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification.
we have a motion and a second. Do you have any other discussion? All in favor? And opposed? We are 9-0. So it brings us to item number 4A, special use permit for a short-term rental. 1321 New Hampshire Street.
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Catherine Wake, one of your planners. I am here to present the second item for you this evening, and that is another short-term rental special use permit. This one is located at 1321 New Hampshire. So here's the location. This is actually in the East Lawrence neighborhood, and it's kind of mid-block on the west side of the 1300 block there. Land use in the area is primarily single-family residential, but this being East Lawrence, there is a mix. There is some multifamily, that's the darker brown. And then on the other side of Massachusetts Street, we have some different uses. But primarily it is residential on this block face that we're talking about. This is the location of the property here. It's kind of hard to see. There's a large tree in the southwest corner, but this is the relevant area that we're going to talk about for their off-street parking. So this just gives you an idea of the layout of the structure and the lot. It's a little bit of a larger lot than is typically found. So the details for this particular one, it is currently a detached dwelling. It's in RS5 zoning district, just like the last one that you saw. The permitted occupancy limit would be the same, which is 3 unrelated occupants per dwelling unit. This structure has 4 off-street parking spaces. 3 of those are tucked under that tree that I showed you, and 1 is in the structure of the garage. So they do have the opportunity for 4 off-street parking spaces. The existing structure is a 4-bedroom dwelling unit, and they are proposing to use 4 bedrooms in the dwelling unit for the short-term rental. So running through all the criteria and making sure that use and size and capacity and meeting the occupancy requirements, staff is recommending approval, again, of this special use permit located at 1321 New Hampshire. And the conditions are almost the same. They would have the 3 unrelated occupants, just for the same zoning district, RS5. The maximum number of guest rooms available on this special use permit would be 4 guest rooms. They do have the off-street parking to accommodate that. And the dwelling unit, again, should remain residential in appearance and characteristics, and they should also reapply for their rental license through Planning and Development Services annually. I'd be happy to answer questions if you have them.
Thank you, we may.
Okay.
And is the applicant here tonight?
Good evening. I'm Rena Burkhart. Let me sign in. I inherited this house a couple years ago, 2 years ago, last January, actually. And I've been using it to restore the house. It's an 1870s Queen Anne Victorian in sad repair. It still has plaster walls, and even though I've done a lot of painting and repairing, it still has plaster walls. It has a tin ceiling in the living room, which has been restored. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to have this income to restore that house. I do plan on moving there eventually. I currently live with my mother, who is a breast cancer survivor, and as soon as she passes, I will be moving into this house. It's very dear to me. So, and in answer to some of your questions, Airbnb does have a special badge called a superhost, and they also have ratings. I have hosted more than 250 groups through this house. I do have a 4.9 rating and am a superhost now for 6 quarters in a row. I have neighbors that help me. They come over and help me do things. I live in the country on a poultry farm. And if my guests call and say, oh, we're not gonna get there till 7, we thought we'd be checking in, and I know that's gonna be after dark, I have several neighbors I can call and say, will you go over to my house and turn on the porch light, because my Airbnb people are going to arrive later. And they're happy to do that to keep me from having to drive into town to do it. So I have motion sensor lights on the place, and have never had any issues. So if you have any other questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, we may.
Okay.
Are there any members of the public who'd like to speak on this item?
Courtney Shipley. It's really kind of a question, and I know you guys have kind of talked about it before, and I'm sure the commission did too. I have no concerns about this particular address, but when the number of 4 people, but the 3 unrelated people, the question in my mind pops up, how is that enforceable? And I'm still not sure that I've heard the answer to that, because they list it, and obviously you can't compel them to list it. Oh, you guys have to be all related, all 4 of you have to be related, or 2 of you have to be related, or whatever combination of that might be. And it seems a little bit burdensome for them, but I wondered if staff could talk about whether that's really enforceable.
Thank you. All right, any other members of the public? Okay, with that, we'll close the public portion, and we will direct that question to staff, since you seem ready.
Well, we have spoken a little bit to that through this process, and our response usually is it's a challenge, as you can well imagine. But I do feel like we do have some abilities, primarily through comments, testimony, and evidence collected by neighbors, and also the fact that there is a lot of information on the website, once we find it and dig in, that can speak to that, right? I mean, you're bound to find some evidence in there of whether or not it was a family, it was a kind of a traditional nuclear family, or it was a party house, or whatever it is. I think it starts with a complaint, and then it grows from there into evidence gathering phase, and then from there it's contact with the special use permit holder. And from there, it's pursuing compliance through whatever legal means we have. So it's challenging. We have occupancy limits today, though, and we do have a couple times a year the pleasure of dealing with those things, and those are some of the ways we do it. It sometimes can be a little bit of a burden on neighbors who oftentimes have information about the situation at the house and can tell us those things. Sometimes, frankly, they're some of our younger population, and they like to kind of talk when asked questions, so we usually get evidence that way. But it's a challenge, but not completely overbearing.
I have a question for you. Is it possible to require as a condition that they list on their site, on their advertising sites, that occupancy level? Or would that need to have been written into the program in the first place?
Why we did or didn't do that? Yeah, they may be technically challenged to do that on their on their website. But it did come up when we created the program for any kind of short-term rental. And I'm drawing a blank on the reason we didn't require that, but something we could explore.
I think it'd be good to explore. I mean, that's that first level of advertising, and if they're advertising for the number of occupants that we also allow, that would be a good first start.
I would say just by looking at other houses advertised on Airbnb, not any of these applicants, I might add. Some of them will say 2 bedrooms, 5 guests. So I think it's probably, cat's already out of the bag a little bit on that.
Well, a family of 5 would still qualify
guess
under
it
3 unrelated.
I guess it could, yeah.
They would have to talk about unrelated.
But, yeah, but to your point, though,
We'd have to talk about defining that. It gets
Yeah.
complicated pretty quick, but
I like adding the condition of just a specification on the ad for VRBO or Airbnb or whatever says, you know, according to City of Lawrence zoning, these conditions exist for this property.
If we're not sure it can be added on all platforms, though, I think we'd be hard pressed to make it a
I
requirement.
agree. And that's why I'm not
Yeah.
asking that we direct staff to do that at this time, but I think that needs to be something that we look into.
I would agree. It's something that maybe we direct staff to see what might be reasonable to try and make sure that it's being advertised for what we're also licensing them to do.
yeah, I do believe that in our license, so we hit this occupancy issue every place we can, right? We hit it here, we hit it with the license that requires them to sign off that they understand the code related to occupancy.
We don't understand.
But at the end of the day, it's how they manage and operate, and it's also what people who actually rent the property do and who they bring. And so versus long-term, where it's a little more manageable, I think this presents a little bit greater challenge for us and for the owner of the rental.
Well, I'm not sure that you're gonna ever have, well, why hedge? You're never gonna have 100% enforcement on this or anything else. But if we can encourage conditions to be met to where all parties acting honestly self-regulate to a certain extent, and then neighbors, through reporting to the city, deal with those outliers, it's gonna get most of the bell curve.
I think it would be a help.
Yeah.
I'm keeping a list. We have several things to explore after tonight's discussion.
Could we have this, the rental map again?
The rental map?
Yep.
For this.
Now we're going north of Central, so,
We didn't go far.
no, we're not. We're like a block and a half apart.
As I understood what you said, Scott, that this really is, enforcement is complaint driven.
Yes.
Can you see that?
Zoom in a little bit.
Well, can we just pull into, say, between Connecticut and Massachusetts, north of 14th Street? Yeah. But this just starts to show the difference in the use of the homes for rentals just between the two, just a block away from each other, basically, in East Lawrence and down into.
Starts to get a little more common.
This is, most of this street is rentals.
It's showing some older accessory structures,
Mhm.
but I believe they are not all there anymore.
Madam Chair, can I ask staff?
Sure, go ahead.
So, as you move forward with the potential mapping of this, what would be valuable to me, and hopefully someone else, so if it's just valuable to me, then ignore it, but if it's valuable to anyone else, is having not separate maps, but I'm looking mainly at Jeff, some sort of color coding that has,
Glad you're looking at Jeff.
Non-owner occupied is a color, and then owner occupied,
Absolutely.
short-term rental is another color.
That is one of that, we're trying to work out the details, is how to get both of them to show up on the same map, update at the same rates, and then be where you can actually understand what's going on with them. So it's something we do have in the works. Last I knew of, we were hoping to get that launched very soon, but we didn't have an exact date yet.
Okay.
Mid-March is the last I heard.
And this is a map of licensing for long-term rentals.
Long-term.
So
License, this is,
would we,
yes.
would we assume that most of our long-term rentals are licensed, or do we, what's our compliance rate, do you suppose, for that?
Yeah, through a series of pursuing those that are, we continually look for rentals that are not licensed through other means that we won't necessarily share.
But it's on public record. You don't want to give everyone your secrets out?
But including newspaper ads and websites and matching up some other things related to utilities. I would say we're pretty confident that we've got greater than 95% of them,
Okay.
probably close to 100, the way, because we've been at it for years now. It wasn't, I wouldn't have said that right after long-term rental came up, even 2 years after. But because we've really taken the effort to pursue them, yes, I think we're there. And I think we're still less than 200 total short-term rentals that we can call from Airbnb, for example. So the universe, whereas we've got over close to 20,000 units of long-term, we've got less than 200 of short-term, just to put in perspective.
However, that is likely going to grow.
I think that's part of what Madam Chair said, which is we don't know the full impact and what's going to happen. This industry has changed quite quickly over a few years, from, renting out a sofa to companies buying up houses and doing this, and I've heard hotel companies getting into the action. So it's an evolution, and many cities are grappling with it, and this is how we're grappling with it.
I have a question for staff. Thank you. The applicant indicated that she was intending to move into the property in the not too distant future at some point. How does that impact a non-owner occupied short-term rental SUP?
Well, once and if that happens and she owns the structure, the special use permit would no longer really apply, and she may want to work with us to get a letter, because it falls under our owner occupied, which both of them require licensing and inspecting it, but the owner occupied doesn't require the special use permit. I think what you'll find too is that these special use permits become commodities. And once you receive it and it runs with the land, you're able to sell it as a permitted short-term rental.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
So even if she, for some reason, wanted to live there and use it as owner-occupied short-term rental, if she wanted to maintain that commodity, she could just pay her licensing fees, keep that SUP active, and then when she went to sell it, or if she changed her plan, or however she wanted to utilize the structure, she would still have that SUP that would be active.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question for staff. Can you remind us of the terms for renewing the rental permit, the rental license, and what are the potential conditions for revocation of the license? Or denial of the renewal?
License itself?
Yes.
Well, most of the licensing requirements just have to do with information, right? Who it is, whether or not they live, well, owner occupied, they're gonna live here. I can't recall if we require a resident agent. I think we do. If you live more than 40 miles outside the city, I know that's true for long-term. The inspection, of course, has to be met and complied with. But it's mostly ministerial things that, if you were going down to license your dog, you would give them information, and then you would get your license and go on your way. It's very much like that.
Okay, thank you.
There's very little discretion, I guess, is what I'm saying. I think that there are certain things that we also build into the license that are violations of the licensing procedures. Occupancy may be one of them, I don't recall. So so again, that's another way we hit the occupancy issues. So you can be found in violation of your license if you're owner occupied by violating certain parts of the city code as well. So you don't get a free pass if you're owner occupied, but, so we control it through the license itself.
Thank you.
I don't have any particular concerns about this SUP. Do we have any other thoughts on that? Would anyone care to make a motion?
I'll make
Go ahead.
I move that we approve a special use permit for non-owner occupied short-term rental use located at 1321 New Hampshire Street and forward the request to the City Commission with a recommendation of approval subject to the 4 conditions identified in the staff report.
And do we have a second? Second. Thank you, Commissioner Payton. Do we have any other discussion? Okay, all in favor? And opposed? Be 9-0. Item number 5, a special use permit for short-term rental of 630 Indiana Street.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Luke Mortensen. I'm a City County Planner with a request to consider a non-owner occupied short-term rental special use permit for an existing residence, like Commissioner Willie said, at 630 Indiana Street. So the subject property, indicated by the star in the outline, is located between 6th and 7th Streets on the east side of Indiana Street. This is in the Old West Lawrence neighborhood. The property is zoned RS5. It's our single dwelling residential district. RS5 district surrounds the subject property to the north, south, east, and west. Detached dwelling residential land uses surround the subject property. There's a little bit of multifamily. You can see with that darker shade of yellow. To the north along 6th Street, there is a pocket of commercial strip zoning and land use. This is the Rumsey Yost Funeral Home. So a closer up aerial of the subject property, it contains an existing detached dwelling and has previously been used as a long-term rental property. The request tonight is for 2 guest rooms, a little bit different from the 2 previous applications before this. The parking requirement, so remember that, the parking requirement for non-owner occupied short-term is 1 off-street space per guest room. The subject property has no off-street parking spaces. This is an existing condition. Due to the house's age, it was built prior to zoning, it came into existence before 1927. There's never been off-street parking at this site. It's an existing nonconformity. And for that reason, an allowance of 2 parking spaces has been granted. The number of parking spaces, 2, aligns with the proposed number of guest rooms, which is also 2. So to summarize, the existing legal use is detached dwelling. That use is permitted in the RS5 district, as is the short-term rental. Like I mentioned, RS5 zoning, same 3 unrelated occupants. This goes with the zoning district. Like I mentioned before, the number of off-street parking spaces existing is 0, but with the allowance of the 2 spaces, that matches the number of existing and proposed guest rooms. So based off the findings found in the staff report provided to you, staff recommends approval of a special use permit located at 630 Indiana Street and forwarding the request to City Commission subject to the following conditions. So similar conditions, 3 unrelated occupants, maximum 2 guest rooms, maintaining the residential appearance and characteristics, and then of course obtaining the short-term rental license from Development Services. 2 notes. The applicant, Lita Sedlock, was prepared and ready to be here tonight. Some family health concerns have her out of state tonight, but her partner is here and able to speak to the application. Also, Commissioner Carter mentioned at the beginning of the meeting a complaint or a comment about this application came in today, so I haven't seen this comment. Myself or the applicant may be able to address whatever it is. So with that, stand for some questions.
Thank you. And we'll have the representative of the applicant come and speak to us.
Madam Chair, since
Yes.
I do know what the comments are, I think it would be appropriate at this time for Commissioner Carter to share his ex parte communication so that not only the commission but the applicant have full value of that.
Okay. Commissioner Carter.
Thank you. I think it's appropriate for me to just read the email, since I don't want to misrepresent it. This is, as I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, this is from my sister-in-law. She had intended to be here. Also, a conflict prevented her from appearing. But it is addressed to the Planning Commission, which is why I think it's appropriate to share. She says, I'm writing today, Dear Metropolitan Planning Commission, I'm writing today in response to a letter I received regarding the special use permit for a non-owner occupied short-term rental property at 630 Indiana Street in RS5 zoning district. I live across the street, 633 Indiana, from the above referenced home. My husband, Paul Carter, and I have a strong objection to this type of non-owner occupied short-term rental property. It is a direct contradiction to the single-dwelling residential neighborhood we thought we moved into a year ago. In the past, there have been two disturbing incidents related to this property. One, my daughter was awakened by gunshots outside of our house at 1 a.m. about 9 months ago. When we woke, a police car was in front of our house investigating the gunfire. The police officer told us that someone had shot and hit the car belonging to the renters at the Airbnb across the street. The shot went through the front door and out the other side. Two, my husband and I were sitting in our family room a month ago when we heard someone rattling at our doorknob trying to get into our house. My husband opened the door to see a confused man. He didn't remember the address of his Airbnb, but knew the door was unlocked, so he was trying random doors to see if any would open. This was particularly disturbing as it was fairly late in the evening and we were obviously startled by this frightening intrusion. I've spoken to other neighbors on our block, just doors away from the property in question, who say they did not receive the notification, but I did, but who are not in favor of this type of non-owner occupied short-term rental in a single-family residential neighborhood. This type of housing has a destabilizing influence in a neighborhood and reduces the friendships you make with your neighbors. For this reasons, we are opposed to non-owner occupied short-term rentals. Thank you for taking my comments into consideration this evening.
If you'd like to address that and anything else that you'd like to about your property.
Sure. Charlie Sedlock. My wife has been working with Luke on this for some time. And first of all, I'd like to say that we really appreciate the focus and the diligence and the intent of what you guys are trying to do. We've been residents of Lawrence for most of 35 years. We lived in this house for many years in the 90s. We love the neighborhood. We know a lot of the neighbors. I know Paul, whose wife wrote that. And so, first of all, thanks for the level of professionalism and what you guys are bringing to this. We are in no way trying to adversely affect anything. And in fact, to the contrary, what I would say, based on the folks that utilize our Airbnb, and feel free to go out and look at our reviews. We are a 100% 5-star Superhost rated. We will be completely candid and transparent on everything. You can go find it on there right now. I know they try and kind of hide the address, but you can kind of, you can find all that. The folks that are using our Airbnb are usually alumni and folks that are coming back to Lawrence for the experience of Lawrence, and we recommend everybody go downtown and spend local dollars in Lawrence, and that is the profile of the folks that come visit us. These are folks that like to walk just like folks in Old West Lawrence like to walk. They like to go to the brewery or the new brewery opening up. They like the library. They like going to the stadium. The exact same things that the residents of Old West Lawrence do every day. So those are the folks we have. And so I will tell you, a lot of the alumni coming back, I know some of you guys probably ventured out after getting your degree and have come back, they fly in and they rent one vehicle. So in terms of the parking issue, the parcel has never had off-street parking since 1922. We always had 2 cars, and so there's about a 95% reduction in parking because almost everybody, 95% plus, shows up in one vehicle now, so parking is not an issue. In terms of appearance and the character of the property, I think it fits in very well. I would say that if you looked at the 2 long-term rentals on either side, that you would see a distinct upgrade in terms of the appearance of our property. And they're great neighbors, love them, but it's just, it is what it is. In terms of the concerns brought up, during March Madness last year, and we're very concerned, anytime there's anything with regard to a gunshot, we are very, very concerned. And so we worked with the police department. It's been investigated. And what the police department found out, that this was a random shot that would have happened regardless of what was going on there by a transient passer through. And you can actually look at the report L180-19646 and look at the actual findings by the police department, that we're glad it went into a car and the bullet stopped there. And so anyway, it had nothing to do with this property, and the police have said there was no correlation. So anyway, very disconcerting. We're glad nobody was hurt. Somebody was walking through that neighborhood, whether this was owned by an owner occupant, a long-term rental, or a short-term rental, that was happening no matter what. So in terms of the other incident, we've not heard of anything like that. I'm not saying it did not happen. We've also interviewed a number of neighbors around that have actually given us very positive reports, and I think your family reached out as a possible renter over the holidays, so just little things. We would love to help, this area. Do we want to see Old West Lawrence have, tons of Airbnbs? I don't think so. I think you guys were going to kind of work through all that. And if you ever want to, convene super hosts and people that love Lawrence and want Lawrence to be a special place and want other people to enjoy it, in the right way, I think we or others would be happy to be part of that conversation. It's not that we are not competing, at least in our realm, with a hotel that much. It's a different client that really wants Lawrence and wants to spend money in Lawrence and help Lawrence become even more special. And so with that, I'm open to any questions. Thank you for your time and consideration tonight.
Thank you.
Yep.
Are there any other members of the public who would like to speak on this item? Okay, back to the commission.
Well, before you take your seat, could I ask you a question or two?
Yes.
I see that this property does have a long-term rental license. So was it rented as long-term rental in the past?
Yes, it was. It was rented since the late 90s. And it did get a little tougher to rent at the very end, so we weren't really taking it out of rent for any kind of increased income or anything. At that size of a house, renters, what we found, were more interested in having the amenities of the big rentals on the west side of town, the covered parking, the swimming pool, all those things. And so we weren't really taking it out of the housing stock, but I do appreciate your comments in the kind of preamble that you had, and so I think that needs to be looked at.
My follow-up is, when did you switch over to short-term rentals?
It was about, like I said, my wife knows all this better. About a year ago, I believe.
All right. And I also noted, we'll pull up the map, but it looks like there's a whole string of houses on that side of your street that are all long-term rentals, but Jeff will pull
Yeah,
up
I
the map.
invite you to drive by and actually
Oh, I
do a
did.
visual on them and guess which one is ours. Anything else?
Yeah, thank
We
you.
may, you never know,
Yep.
but you may have a seat. Thank you.
Madam Chairman? I do have a question.
Oh.
I'm sorry, can you give me the name of that police report one more time?
Sure.
The
Yeah.
number of it?
You ready?
Yes, please.
L180
Uh-huh.
19646.
46. Okay.
Oh, and when I was out there, the alley's only accessible from 7th Street. There's an alley that goes up part way behind you. It doesn't go all the way up to 6th Street, is that correct?
Yeah, it has an L to it, so
Yeah.
there are, I think, a couple of those maybe in Old West Lawrence.
Yeah, I looked down it. I didn't venture driving down it because it looked like I was going to get stuck in somebody's backyard. And I was
Right,
like,
right, yeah, you gotta go gingerly and slowly.
all right, thanks.
We'll have Jeff pull our map up for us.
If I may, I don't have so much a question as just an observation. I'm reminded of a case that we dealt with last month of a non-owner occupied property. I think it was in the Indian Hills neighborhood near South Junior High, where there were a couple of neighbors who objected to the presence of this short-term rental. But one of the observations that we made collectively was it's an opportunity for neighbors, for the owners to get to know the neighbors better. And there was a conversation that took place, during the meeting about sharing contact information and ensuring that, in the interest of neighborliness, that all of the neighbors had the contact information for the owner in case, and this was I think it was definitely an out-of-town owner, maybe an out-of-state owner, in the case that something comes up that's troubling. And I guess I would ask Mr. Sedlock, is that something that you would be willing to do?
In fact, we had communications after that incident with at least
Sir, would
the
you,
neighbors on our.
would you come to the microphone so
Sure, sorry about
our
that.
3 viewers
Yeah,
on
yeah.
YouTube?
So, it's hard for everybody to hear and it doesn't record well. So, yes, in fact, we communicated just the next day with folks that we communicate with a little more regularly about that incident. We are more than happy to share our information with anybody in the neighborhood and about every 4th or 5th house. And, we know a lot of them already, but we're happy to do that.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Commissioner Ash.
I just have a kind of a comment question for staff, not particularly for this piece of property, given that it's a long-term rental going to a short-term rental. But some of the others, in the interest of looking at long-term impacts of this industry, so you said that the license that goes with these is basically in perpetuity unless there's a revocation of the license?
That, and as long as it doesn't expire under the owner's actions. So I was thinking about what Catherine had said, and, we look at the use of the property, and there's some components of our code that would say after a year, there may be a situation where that use is expired, and they would have to come back for a special use permit. So to a certain degree, somebody can hold on to it. We see that with long-term rentals sometimes, that someone will temporarily go back into their unit and live there. They want to take it off the books, but really that license is good for a year, and by the time that year's up, they're back renting it long-term. And so this market really fluctuates quite a bit, but maybe I'm
I
not.
guess my concern was that possibly as these increase in number, that as we're bumping up against our affordable housing stock, which is
Right.
a big issue, that I wonder about these properties being sold, converted from single-family, lived-in units, residences, affordable housing, and then being converted
Yeah, and again, our observations today are that it's small enough scale not to impact it. There are some cities and many articles floating around there that highlight that very issue and impact. But the flip side of that coin is that even in those cities where that's an impact, it's very hard to just say you can't do it. So most cities are taking the route of regulating it to some degree because it's so prevalent, it's so easy to do. It's based on a software platform that you can become a landlord in 10 minutes by signing up with a platform. And so I think right now the conventional wisdom is to regulate them, know where they are, understand the impacts, and then react accordingly. And I think that's kind of where we are right now.
Thank you.
I'd like to come back to an idea that Mr. Sedlock mentioned kind of in passing, and this is more about that broader discussion about the short-term rentals. We've talked about the competition between short-term rentals with hotels. We've had that discussion from when we first were making this text amendment. We haven't talked about that this may be in part a response to competition from the influx of large luxury multifamily complexes. And that was an idea that was mentioned, and I'd never really thought about that how much, because we have had a lot of multifamily come onto the scene in the last few years, and always wondered, well, where did all these people come from? Well, possibly they're partially drawing away from some of our more established neighborhoods that have had rentals in them. So I think that may be just a piece of the discussion we maybe should keep on our radar as part of the puzzle.
So if I catch your meaning correctly, you're saying that as a customer base of long-term rentals move toward a different area of the city, that this is kind of a transitional use that maintains the property, maintains the physical maintenance of the property, make sure that the owner, the landlord, is still putting energy into it as a temporary use until there's some sort of more permanent solution?
Well,
Is that kind of your feeling, or?
I'm not sure, but I
Okay.
guess what I'm saying is, if there's been a shift in the market demand of renters,
Right.
rather than have these houses in neighborhoods that we care about become non-rentable if we don't
Yeah.
have a rental population
Yeah.
that wants them, that this may be a very appropriate answer to that issue. And I hadn't thought of it in that light. That certainly puts it in a fairly positive light, but it's just something I think we should consider or continue to think about.
I guess I also wanted to call attention to the letter from Mr. Tim Miller, who actually endorsed the Sedlocks as responsible neighbors and landlords, said he didn't have any particular problem with this property, but would strongly object to second one. And so this comes back to this question of if the individual property meets all of the conditions of a rental, what is that threshold at which it's appropriate to decline a request for a special use permit, especially given how difficult it is to I don't want to say revoke one, but I mean, really is up to the inaction of the owner for the special use permit to be canceled. The owner has to not renew their rental license for more than a year, is that right?
Right, every year it's annually, yeah.
Right. And there don't seem to be any particular obstacles to, renewing that license. And so my concern isn't with regard to this particular property. I mean, I think this communication obviously, makes my antenna prick up, but it's this, is this something, I guess maybe this is a question for staff or people who were on the commission before I joined. Was this issue of the irrevocability of the special use permit a topic of conversation, and, is that something worth considering as a strategic change at some point in the future, making it easier to review and easier to not renew at some interval? So I guess I would ask Scott first.
You know, I don't know at what level we discussed it, but if it was, it would have been in the vein of, the reason, again, we're putting conditions to it is that typically when we go toward revoking a special use permit, it's because they're not complying with either conditions or the code in some way. So if they are remain in compliance with the code, then they should get the benefit of having that special use permit active on that property. So, yeah, we, that's our standard position on it. But they need both. They need the non-owner occupied need the special use permit and the license in order to be legal.
Yeah.
So we feel like, given the framework we've created, we've got pretty good mechanisms to attempt and pursue ceasing an operation if they're not complying with the code some way.
And we don't currently have a threshold for how many can be in a neighborhood, or, I mean, that's gonna be just part of this ongoing discussion, and whether owner-occupied fall into that also when we meet that threshold. That's just gonna be part of our ongoing discussion also, until something kind of comes up with clarity that needs to be changed in the text itself. But does anyone have any concerns about the unique parking situation?
I don't know. I mean, it's already non-conforming. I don't know that I thought about that during the staff brief on, is this a condition that would prevent approval of the special use permit? I've got concerns with it, but I don't know that it can necessarily prohibit approval of the special use permit. Because it's through no fault of the owner, it just wasn't a thing.
Is the parking addressed at all in the ORIAD neighborhood plan or design guidelines?
For this situation, no. This is more of whether it's kind of a non-conforming situation, and then whether it's equal to the detached dwelling requirement. So our position, and strangely, we're seeing several of these like this that are kind of on smaller non-conforming lots. They've got no parking, so they're called what we call legal non-conforming components of the lot. And so if that's true for the detached dwelling, which requires 2 parking spaces, our position and recommendation is that they should get the benefit of those 2 spaces, which allows them to have 2 guest rooms in a special use permit. We do have one, or maybe more, one going through the Board of Zoning Appeals right now that is seeking 3 guest rooms with no parking. And the discussion we're having there is, well, we would recommend 2, because that's what you get for a detached dwelling. They're seeking more than that. And so, again, that I think is contextual. If you had somebody come in with, that had received a variance and for any number of parking above and beyond that, I think you would have a responsibility too to look at the impact that has on the neighborhood and the on-street parking and that sort of thing. But from our position, we're saying that 2 guest room short-term rental is equivalent to a 2 parked detached dwelling unit.
It is this port of the ORIAD neighborhood involved in that general downtown parking review, or looking for solutions for the parking problems through there?
No,
Okay, it's outside that area.
it is outside that.
All right.
Yeah, it's not in the ORIAD neighborhood, and it's not in the downtown neighborhood. It is in its own unique
Right.
neighborhood.
And I have questions about the use of the Board of Zoning Appeals, but maybe we'll save that for when this one you're referring to comes up.
Yes, sir.
Do we have any concerns specific to this property to discuss, or further questions? I would entertain a motion. Commissioner Weaver.
I'd move approval of a special use permit for a non-owner occupied short-term rental use located at 630 Indiana, forwarding the request to the City Commission with a recommendation for approval, subject to the conditions 1 through 4 in the staff report.
Thank you. And do we have a second? Commissioner Struckoff. Any further discussion? Oh, you
I
do.
would just say that I appreciate you bringing up the point of the impending application with the request for 3. Just before you brought that up, I was thinking, what is going to be the tipping point on that number? And when I think about, say, a larger house that is in a neighborhood that has no parking, that does not have a ton of off-street parking, and I don't know how many 4 or 5 bedroom houses there are that don't have their own off-street parking. There may be some in this neighborhood, there may not. But I'm not sure, I'm not sure whether an arbitrary limit of 2 granted spaces, 2 spaces allowance, is a good limit. On its face, it seems like it is, because, I don't know, I guess most limits are arbitrary.
Yeah.
And I'm not suggesting that as a limit, but it did strike me as what is the number? And that's what you're going to be grappling with, and I guess we will too. I don't want to beg the question, but that is, we'll get to that application when we get to it, I guess.
Any further discussion? Mr. Sands.
Oh,
No, please go ahead.
Okay. I think it's probably more germane to as we try to develop additional criteria for the Lawrence Douglas County Planning Commission's discussion of short-term and long-term rentals, owner-occupied, non-owner-occupied, short-term rentals. The things that were mentioned in Commissioner Carter's email about criminal events, calls for service, things like that. Because the police department, you cannot look up a specific numbered police report through the police department. I think there's probably services that you could pay for. I don't know. There is a community crime map through LexisNexis, and oddly, it doesn't show anything in that neighborhood for several blocks around that address over the last year. What I'm saying is, I think it is germane to the discussion to be talking about any calls for service that have happened in that area. Or rather, I would like someday in this body to talk about whether or not that is an appropriate factor to bring up.
I would think that would be the right thing to do, would be talk about whether it's
Yeah.
an appropriate factor.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of factors that go into a call for service that are.
Yes.
Yeah, not anyone's fault.
And may I ask one more question of staff before we?
Sure.
And this is, last month, we also dealt with this request from the drop-in shelter for a special use permit. Of course, it was very different circumstances, but calls for service were a very big part of that discussion. And if the special use permit was we recommended the approval with a term of 3 years. And I wanted to just, I guess partially a question, but also a statement. I would support examining the prospect for amending the code to allow for some sort of renewable permit in the future as we do gain a greater understanding. I mean, if we are looking at this economy as it evolves, but we find ourselves in a place where we discover we've created conditions that we don't like, and yet there's nothing we can do about it because of the terms of the permits we've already granted. I think it's something it's better to look at before that happens. And I guess I just asked Scott if that's something that is even within the limits of the possibility, if it's practical.
I think you could make that recommendation to the governing body through your discernment here, and especially as this evolves and you get a couple more months' worth of experience on it. After your vote, I'll maybe share the list I've compiled of these issues that you're asking us to look at and ask if you have any more, but I will add that one to it.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we'll have that discussion after our vote. Do we have any further discussion on the vote? All in favor? And opposed? We are 9-0. So, your list.
Madam Chair, as we leave this topic, here's my list of items that we will kind of explore. Revise the application to seek voluntary information on user comments from the platform. Include a rental map, a snapshot of the rental map in every packet of information we give to you, both long, short-term, and as we build our new map system. Explore requiring occupancy limits on the software platform as either a special use permit condition or maybe even a code requirement for the whole program. And other code program issues are requiring contact information be shared with neighbors and time limits on special use permits. I can't recall if we require contact info. I know that even owner-occupied short-term rentals must send out a letter, which to me makes me think they have the contact info, but just making sure that our program has that, we'll explore.
Can I ask for a clarification from Commissioner Carter, actually? Are you asking that the special use permit be something that is a shorter term than forever? Or is the licensing something that can, because that's renewable every year. And I assume that
Understood.
the licensing requirements would also have something about not, as it's a complaint-based system, that there not have been significant complaints.
That's an excellent question. I would say some mechanism, regardless of whether it's through the license or the special use permit. I mean, the license, if there was some mechanism to deny renewal based on calls for service, that would be, I think, really worth considering. But again, don't
Does
know.
that
We'll look at it
give you
and
some
give you an update.
clarification?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And for number one, about the voluntary information, in addition to the comments, if you would request which platforms the property is listed on and the listing numbers, because that will get us to the actual site that's on all of them, instead of trying to hunt down by looking, oh, that looks like the property.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing, a screenshot or something of the listing
Yeah.
and the number of, if it's on 1 or 4 or whatever, 1 for each. Just so that we know what they're telling people. You know, if they're saying it's not gonna be a party house, but the ad says, great party house. And then, I think probably staff's already got or figured this out based on Commissioner Carpenter's asking for the map to be put up there, but that would probably be,
We got it.
got it.
Commissioner
That's a
Ashford?
gimme. We'll give you that next month.
As far as the time limits go, I'm wondering if one option might be that when the property is sold, maybe that's just not a given, that it's sold with the property, and that might be a way of putting not quite an arbitrary time limit on of 3 years, but just when the property's sold, that's not.
We'll look at it,
Something
we'll
that goes
explore
with it.
all that.
I would also like to add my name to the,
Short-term rental list?
yeah. To Commissioner Carter's request that we explore it, and maybe it becomes a mid-month topic or something, that we looked at, see how we continue to shape this.
Okay, that would give us some time to flesh this out a little
Yeah,
bit.
absolutely.
Certainly a good number of issues and clarifications for month 2. Yes.
We're learning our way as we go. Do we have any other discussion on this before we move on to our next item? Item 6 was deferred, so item 7, conditional use permit for Big Springs Quarry, and some familiar faces.
Good evening, Commission. I'm Mary Miller, current planner, and this, as you said, is a CUP or conditional use permit that was deferred. It was brought to you earlier. It's a request to reduce the performance bond for reclamation. The property is on the very west side of the county. It's a very large quarry. When it came to you last time, we looked at what the original performance bond was. It was set at $40,000, and that was based on an estimate at that time of what the engineer thought it would cost. In 2008, they provided bids that we looked at, and the county engineer recommended that we set the performance bond at $10,000 based on those bids. And you suggested that the applicant go out and get more current bids. And so they did go out and get 3 bids. I suggested that they use the same firms that gave them the original bids. However, one of those firms, it was a lawn care firm. It went out of business, and they indicated they really didn't think they'd probably be capable of doing this type of reclamation. And the other 2 firms they're in direct competition with now, and so they didn't think that'd be appropriate to try to get bids from them. So we have these 3, Ham and King's Construction are very well known in this area. And Carlson Utility, they do a lot of work, a lot of groundwork for laying large utility projects. And they all came in right around $3,000. And so I forwarded this to the county engineer to review, and he noted there were 2 issues that he thought the bid should be a little higher. One was the seeding mix, and this is a note that's on the approved reclamation plan. It tells how the seeding should be, and they're required to have a grass wildflower mix, prairie grass or wildflower mix, either set by the Kansas Department of Transportation, or they can use a seeding mix that's approved by Quails Unlimited. And so he said that would be a little bit more expensive than the fescue mix that they're proposing, which is pretty much the standard minimum that the state would require. And he didn't think, he said the seeding itself would be about 3 times as much, but he didn't think that the entire line item would go up 3 times because there's other things involved. But then he also noticed the inflation factor, because we're looking at today's prices. The lifetime of this quarry CUP is 30 years, but to be conservative, he used a 3% inflation factor, and he took it out for 20 years. And based on that, it came up to a little bit over $5,000 an acre. So he thought that based on these bids, Mid-State Materials track record, and then the fact that taking into account inflation, being a little conservative, because no one knows what will happen after 20 years, it's hard to even imagine, that $5,000 would be an appropriate performance bond. And so we're recommending the reduction from $40,000 to $5,000, and then that would revise those 2 conditions. They're noted in the back of your staff memo, just changing the amounts so that they correlate to the $5,000 an acre. And as you noted, the applicant is here today.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. And sir, would you like to address us?
Good evening. Red Checkert, Mid-States Materials. I'd like to start by thanking Mary for all her good work, and also the county engineer. You already know this. They've been great to work with, and we do appreciate that. I'd like to renew my request for $3,000, and I sit here looking, I don't want to look a gift horse in the mouth because they've been great to work with, and we're talking about a pretty substantial reduction, so we do appreciate that. The funny thing is that the county engineer pointed out an inflation factor, when in fact this is getting cheaper and cheaper every year. It's the opposite of inflation. We think that our next reclamation, that we're going to go under $1,000 an acre, and that's using the fancy seed. On a reclamation in a different county, we're going to get very close to the state's limit at $650. We are going to get that close. So I understand, using inflation and locking in 2019 values, but the truth of the matter is everything's getting more efficient and better, and the machinery is so much better now, and who knows what that machinery will be like in 20 years. It'll be on electrical batteries, right, and powered by solar. It'll be even cheaper. So with that, we do renew our request for the $3,000. I think the bids showed that. I mean, we didn't make up the $3,000. We checked around, and we knew that was higher than what we can do it. And then the bidding, of course, kind of backed up what we said. We think it's $3,000. I will point out one thing that we did learn is that landscaping companies make their money by putting roses in front of houses and small trees in front of commercial buildings. They don't make money with bulldozers. So, yeah, they just don't do that sort of work. So that's when we branched out to the excavating firms. So with that, I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. We may have some. Well, I'll say, I'm glad we took the extra time to get the other bids, and I appreciate everyone for being willing to work with that. It does give us some more information, more concrete information to work with. I understand renewing your request for the 3,000. I'm actually very comfortable with the 5,000, because we know that that gives us any room for, hiring an ecologist to fulfill that. I know you keep one on staff even for your own use, for your own work. But I think that 5,000 is certainly a much better number than 40,000, makes you more competitive in the market. I know it doesn't quite put you down to the level of your competition, but I think we can make steps in the future to try and be more fair, and this is maybe step one.
And thank you, and I'm glad you said that, because I forgot to say that earlier. But we would like to see whatever the number is to be applied to everybody going forward. So, that's not obviously something we can enforce, but it is something that you can enforce. So I would make that point, that I do want to see, whatever the number is, it's the same for everybody.
Certainly that is noted. Thank you. Any
I have
other?
a question
Go
for
ahead.
staff. So the county engineer, was it on the line items in the estimates? Was it only the amount, cost of reseeding that the county engineer had an issue
Right,
with?
that's the only line item that he thought was too low. And he just thought it was a little too low, so I think when he did his calculations, he noted it, but he basically based it on inflation. He didn't
Okay.
go in and adjust that line item.
Do we have, you said he had calculations, are we privy to those? I didn't happen to see those in the
The
report. I may have
inflation
missed them.
calculation is the one that he worked out. He just
No.
used his information from the county when they do their plantings, and
Okay.
because they have to plant along the highways, and so
Okay.
he knows what that seeding costs.
Okay.
And I think that's why he did not include it in his overall figure, but he just wanted to let us know that it probably would be a little higher because you have to use the better seeding. But no, that's not actually included. He based that 5,000 on the inflation rate. Because he took the 3,000 at 3% for 20 years.
No, I'm tracking that. I guess, what I'm asking is, one of these ham estimates seeding and mulch, brome or fescue, 40 acres, unit price $600 per acre. I guess what I'm asking is, based on the county's operations, what is his estimate? I know he said it's gonna be a little bit more,
And I
but,
think that's why he couldn't give us an estimate, because the seeds themselves cost 3 times as much. But then he would have to go through that line item and break down how much of what they charge is the seed and how much is the other work they're
As
doing.
the labor of,
And so he
the
didn't
sort-
break
yeah.
that down.
Any other thoughts or questions?
Sure.
Go ahead.
This is a whole new thing to think about last month and this month with this bond request. But from what we heard last month and again this month, I'm inclined to give great deference to the county's estimates, because some of what we heard last month was the bids to the county are generally higher than what we're going to see from business to business. And this is taking into consideration that worst-case scenario that a business just disappears and leaves a problem behind for the county taxpayers, which includes everybody here, to pick up the tab. And it probably wouldn't be using the most efficient equipment available. It's going to be using what comes in as the low bid to the county to do the work. So and you said this has been reduced, 8 times from what it is now? So I think this is probably a good place that whenever another quarry comes up to renew a permit, that we start at this level, if that's what the county's comfortable with, and they think that this is what they can do the work for. Because again, we're talking about the worst-case scenario. That's what the bonds are always for, when things go bad, and to try to, cover as much of the cost instead of, spending other parts of the budget on it that should be available for other things, other road repairs or whatever this budget category actually falls in, which I have no idea which budget category that is, but it's going to come out of some pot that would go to do other work if it's not there. So I'm comfortable with the 5,000, and I'm glad it's come down quite a bit, and I think that reflects the business performance and how good neighbors this quarry is to the community. And I do agree, I think this is a good place that we should put all of them when they come back. It should probably just be the starting point. And then, as this one was adjusted in the past because of bad behavior on the part of the prior owners of the quarry, there's always that possibility too. So I'm comfortable with the 5,000.
Other thoughts? Commissioner Weaver.
I'd say I'm really tickled to see that you're going back with native grasses and forwards. Great. I live real close to the quarry out there. It's a great job. My only concern is that it takes quite a little bit of time to get the natives established, and what happens in that first couple of years before you really have any root system to do much good. Are you doing any nurse crops when you do those at all?
Mm-hmm.
You do? Good.
Yeah, that's how we do it.
Outside of that, I'm tickled, so thank you.
Not to brag, but I think we had a large release of some birds out there since the last time we talked. So, yeah, we're doing that too. Above and beyond, I know, but don't put that in the bond.
But we do appreciate those efforts, we really do, so thank you. I would entertain a motion, unless we have any other discussion first. Commissioner Carter.
I would move that we forward CUP 18-00570 to the Board of County Commissioners with a recommendation for approval of a reduction of the performance bond amount noted in condition 10B and C in the restrictions and conditions of use from $40,000 per acre to $5,000 per acre based on the findings of fact in the staff report and memo, subject to the revised restrictions and conditions of use provided in the attachment B of the report.
Thank you. And do we have a second? Commissioner Payton. Oh, she got in before you did. Any further discussion? All in favor? And opposed? 9-0. I would propose we take a 5-minute break. I know we only have one more item before we hit the comp plan, but we may have some discussion on that item. So I would give us 5 minutes and then we will reconvene shortly. We've reconvened, and we are ready for item number 8, text amendment to the subdivision regulations for residential parcels.
Good evening, Mary Miller, planner, and this amendment was before you a few months ago, and you asked us to go back and find some more information about what the impact would be. And just as a slight bit of background on the text amendment, it came about because of a variance request. We had a property owner that wanted a variance to allow him to divide into 2 RDPs, but he did not have enough frontage. And so based on county staff's recommendation for the variance, we brought that before you, but then we also suggested that perhaps we should look into a text amendment, because if we wanted to make that a rule, that might be more straightforward than having everyone come through with the variance. And so then the discussion has gone on that. So this was a planning commission initiated text amendment. It can go either way. And so I'll show you the information that we found after you had us do the further research. Just to clarify, a principal arterial needs to have 1/4 mile of frontage in order to have 1 residential parcel. It needs to have a 1/2 mile to have 2. And so basically that's the language of the text amendment, that they would reduce it, that you could have 1,320 feet or a 1/4 mile, and you could divide it into 2 parcels, provided you share a driveway. So Jeff, our planning manager, used the GIS map, and he was able to find out the number of parcels we had on a principal arterial that had 20 acres and that had a 1/4 mile of frontage, and then he was able to further divide that out and find out how many had a 1/2 mile of frontage or more. So we have 42 parcels that have 1/2 mile. We have 42 parcels on a principal arterial that could be divided into 2 RDPs. The remainder of them could be just the 1 RDP. So if they're a vested parcel now, there's no further development parcel possible. If they're not vested, they could do a certificate of survey and become 1 parcel. And so with this text amendment, those 167 parcels could divide into two properties or 2 parcels, which would be an increase in 167 parcels. So that would be the amount of additional development you'd be making possible. We have 2,494 parcels outside the UGA that have over 20 acres. 406 of these front on a principal arterial. So the current numbers of RDPs possible now are 251, and with that additional 167, that would raise it to 418. And so that would be, the issue is that too much development, more than we want to see? If so, we would want to either recommend denial of the text amendment or perhaps just table it. And that brings us to the email that Karen Willie was discussing earlier. Zoning and Codes mentioned that perhaps with our work on the comprehensive plan and the revisions to our zoning regulations, which will have some carry-on revisions to the subdivision regulations, that perhaps you'd want to table this and just see where all of that work goes to see if this is really even necessary in the long run. And so that's a third option, which is not included in my recommendations, but that's one. If you find that it would increase it to a significant degree, you could recommend denial. If you find the increase in development acceptable, you could recommend approval, or you have the third option of just deferring it to an indefinite period of time while we let the comprehensive plan and the zoning regulations and the subdivision regulations work out.
Thank you. And Mary, did you say you printed the copy of that email that was?
I did not print it, but that was the subject of it. She was mentioning that with all the work going on with the zoning regulations and the subdivision regulations, the work on the comprehensive plan, that it might be more appropriate to defer it. She was surprised that there was that number of parcels that would be possible. And, you know, until you do the research, you don't really know what the parcels are. And so basically it's up to everyone to decide, is that a significant amount or is that more than you feel comfortable with? It's more than she feels comfortable with, but then that's up for you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, if I may just interject, I think that comes on the heels of discussions and work being done to look at reducing the number of divisions and loss of agricultural land and those kinds of things in the rural areas, that any number that we're adding to what's already on the books in terms of what's allowed to be divided up may be too many at this point. So I think that's the position she had come from. And that's the position that Mary and her together are working on with the county code. So.
I also had, of course, I had a discussion with her also, and it's, and then she said, let me go work on it, came back with that email recommending that we table the discussion until we have the subdivision regulations, which they've been working on modifying those, changing those, updating them, I should say, considerably for the county. They've been working on that for some time, and at some point they'll bring that to us, but it's still in the works. There, and of course, I'm in favor of keeping farm ground intact and those things. There are also other issues that will have to be discussed kind of at that time. I know from our experience with having an 80-acre parcel, no one will give you a mortgage on a house on 80 acres. And so there are other reasons to subdivide it besides adding development parcels. And so making sure that the subdivision regulations allow for people also to get mortgages on their homes should they choose to is another aspect of it. Especially because Tanya's been working very hard on the subdivision regulations, and that she's recommended that we hold off on this discussion and have that as part of a larger discussion with the county, with the county's work already and with the comp plan discussion. I would certainly be in favor of following that recommendation and tabling it for now. Oh, I didn't ask, I'm sorry. Do we have any members of the public who would like to speak on this item? Thank you, Vice Chair. So I open that up for discussion or further questions of staff.
I have one question. What is the frequency of requests?
Well, we don't have a large frequency. I have one applicant that's been waiting to see if the text amendment will be approved or should they apply for a variance. My recommendation to them would be if the text amendment's not approved, staff would not recommend approval of the variance. They can always request it, but I don't see where they meet any other significant criteria. And we've had a few other people, maybe two others, that own maybe 80 acres or 100 acres. They just don't have the frontage that's necessary, and so it has to stay one development parcel. And so they may come forward later, but they would have to bring their cases. So I've just had pre-application meetings with them.
So in your opinion, if we table this until the county subdivision regulations are finished for a review, we're not going to see very many variance requests in that time?
No, I only expect the one, and that may not even come forward.
Commissioner
Question,
Stuckhoff.
Madam Chair, just following up on your comment about the mortgage on an 80-acre parcel. Why is that? What is the, is agricultural land out of suitable security, or?
My understanding is, should they have to foreclose on that, they would rather sell a house in 10 than trying to sell a house in 80, because it has a larger market appeal. So I think that's the reasoning, though I didn't ask, we just had to find a way to comply.
Well, I'm content to table, and I would move that we do so.
I'll second that.
Do we have any other discussion? Okay, all in favor? And opposed? 9-0. Thank you. Thanks.
9-0.
I know. And that brings us back to item number 2, which is the comprehensive plan. And I should ask then, we won't have a staff report at this point, I assume, because we had it on Monday, but I would like to open up again and say, are there any members of the public who would like to speak to us tonight on the comprehensive plan, on any aspect, but our discussion will generally focus on the Environment and Natural Resources chapter that we've been working on since Monday. Would either of the two members of our audience care to address? Okay, thank you. Then I will bring it back to the commission. And on Monday, we made it through all of the sidebars, all of the definitions, the title, not yet the chapter number. We tabled that portion, our discussion, for the end of our work. And then we made it through most of goal number 4, and that's where we finished for the night on Monday. One other discussion that we mentioned, and then I don't think we came to a conclusion one way or the other, we just worked past it, was whether or not we needed to include a line about an open space program in goal number 2, or if that was sufficiently covered in Chapter 7. We discussed it, then we moved on, and I don't think we had a conclusion that we gave to staff. I guess I would propose that we have something, even if it just references that it's also mentioned. I don't want to be redundant, but it seems like this is that the open space program we're talking about is not strictly about parks. It's also falls also under this land resources idea. I'd like to see it somehow worded in both places.
I would agree with that.
So then what would be the differentiation between how open space is viewed in this vice the other chapter when we're talking about parks?
I think the open space program that the Sustainability Office has just pitched to the county will
Okay.
have elements of both.
Mhm.
And I don't think they're going to want it particularly siloed from one to the other and not be allowed to cross over. So is there somewhere where we can make mention that, you know, we have a 2-point something, create an open space plan for the county, and then reference that it's also going to be mentioned in Chapter 7? I'm kind of looking at Jeff and see if you can give me any guidance.
Is it a fair statement that most of the open space in the urban limits will be park use? And that outside the urban limits in the county, it could be either park or preserve type areas, which the county's working on, right?
Yeah, they don't have a definite program.
So I think maybe just to reference something about, maybe just the county part in there.
So build a policy as 2.10 related to an open space,
And it could specifically say open space program for the county, to Commissioner Carpenter's point that open space in the city is probably covered well enough under Chapter 7.
Okay.
Is that clear enough? I think that was our only omission up until we had discussed through much of Goal 4.
Excuse me, Madam Chair.
Yes.
Since this is provoked by an actual proposition or proposal from the Sustainability Office, does it make sense to reference that in the implementation section? You know, reference the open space plan in the implementation section. Since
Yes,
it,
I think so, yeah.
Reference plans usually require the consent of a governing body to make it to that item. This would probably have both the city and the county's consent, would be my, or at least one or the other, if not both, theory. That would then reference into the plan at that point.
But the implementation chapter can have something saying, checking on how far we've gotten working on the open space plan.
Absolutely.
great.
We did not allow ourselves to have the discussion in this Goal 4 about remediation standards, because we had not yet heard the item that came to us today. So are there any thoughts on having some language about remediation of extraction sites?
Madam Chairman, would that be under you're thinking in terms of reclamation, effective reclamation procedures? Is that where that question comes up with criteria, or what was the word you used?
I said reclamation standards,
Standards.
or standardizing our reclamation bond across entities, or setting standards for it. Because the state apparently has standards that we don't feel maybe are adequate in terms of that it just says Romer fescue. It doesn't specify the consulting with an ecologist or anything like that.
Could be develop sustainable and effective harvesting and reclamation standards. We're looking for a standard in reclamation, right?
I had proposed standardized remediation efforts between extraction operations in the county. So,
You mean
just
from operation to
standardizing.
operation, across operations?
you know, what we expect out of a reclamation.
Right.
But other wording.
Madam Chair, your notes up. One thing I would say that came out of the steering committee work is trying to make this readable to the layperson. And, just sort of the flow, the word, the verbiage, kind of say it in a kind of a direct way without a lot of too much technical jargon. I put that out there, not that this is.
And reclamation may be the better word than remediation, because reclamation is what we're talking about.
Yeah, when I hear this verbiage versus reclamation standards, I think, that's what made me think about that issue we had in the steering committee, which was try to bring it to a level that everybody can read it quickly and understand what we're trying to get at.
Would it be appropriate to have a sidebar that defines what we're talking about in that term?
I think we can use a term that's probably better than what I proposed.
Those are both very technical terms with specific meanings, depending which statute you're under. So it's kind of tough.
Add a sidebar?
I was just gonna say.
I don't think you can do it in just a sidebar, if.
We've used all our space in the sidebars.
Some of these pictures we can crop and, I know, Jeff, I'm sorry, the pictures are attractive, but
Gotta have the recycle bin in there.
pull some more. Yeah. I like our recycle program.
But if this is an interactive document, is there a way to hyperlink something
good point.
on reclamation?
We do that with a couple other things in the plan where it jumps out to KDHE or to FEMA or some other documents to kind of provide their guidance, because there's no way we could encapsulate it in the plan without another 400 pages added to it.
I think that's a good compromise.
Okay, well, throw us some language. What do you recommend, Commissioner Sands?
Oh, I thought what we come up with earlier was good. Commissioner Struckhoff, didn't he have a?
Yeah, what did you have?
This is similar. What we're talking about is standardizing so that people know what to expect. So that, for instance, whether it's, and this would cover the bond, the methods, the materials, what the finish looks like. And so by standardizing reclamation efforts or procedures across or between, across the county, something like that.
And then adding hyperlinks that explain instead of going into the sidebar.
I think this language is good.
I think we have reclamation rather than remediation as the word to hyperlink.
So are we striking that from 4.1?
I think it's two things, and we have the harvesting procedures or harvesting standards, which I think maybe needs to stay, and then the second half of that.
Break it out.
Yes.
Carriage return.
I'm just curious, can anyone speak to what actually happens to quarries that are reclaimed? What are their subsequent uses now?
Well,
County
the
people,
state.
anybody?
First of all, it's a pretty rare occurrence. It's that we have a new quarry, but it does happen. And then they typically will present a reclamation plan. Usually those go above and beyond what the state requires, which is pretty minimal, basically cover it up and throw some seed on it. But they can be reclaimed into lakes and redeveloped as that. Some of them are turned over to cities for parks and lake development. Some of them are filled in and developed with any number of uses. So there are a lot of options on how to reclaim quarries and pits. So that's why I would see it as, I'm always projecting down to what the workload is later after we get done. I see it as a very low priority, frankly, for us, because they usually present the plan to us to react to. And for us and then we can look at precedents, and we can look at other quarries in the county, and we can look at those things and say, okay, here's our standard of it, and sort of negotiate the reclamation plan in that way. I think our point in building a policy out of this is that it is effective and sustainable for the community, not that we necessarily have a desire or a need to build some standardized reclamation plan.
I think it does give us some standing, though, if we have someone come forward and they say, well, we're just going to throw down some fescue and walk away, and the state says that's okay, is to say, well, we have a policy that we have held other groups accountable to remediating to this level, reclaiming to this level, and we expect you to also.
But I'm not sure we want every one of them to be the same. I mean, because unless we have different categories of reclamation, right? Here's what we would expect for lakes. Here's what, and is it a ski lake? Is it a fishing lake? Is it a lake with houses around it? You know, is it a city park or a county area? Here's what we would expect if you're going to fill in the quarry. And then, you know, how much of that is gonna be based on the geology of the area and what they're using and the materials and everything. So, you know, I don't mind having a policy that establishes an expectation that we're at a higher level than the state standard, and maybe that should be the goal or the policy, to say we have a high expectations for reclaiming quarries and things. But I'm just not sure we want it standardized and hamstring us into that.
If standardized is too tight, I think some of the language that you presented may be fine, just to let it out there that the state standards for that are not the standards we're looking for in Douglas County.
And I do like that idea that we're going to exceed minimum standards for reclaiming quarries and similar operations.
Well, let's say something about that we want to exceed the minimum standards set by the state for reclamation of extraction. Do we get close enough, Jeff? Something you can write from?
Yep.
All right.
Question, what's a suspended quarry?
Suspended quarry would be one that would have been under operation for a period of time and then has ceased operation for a few years, and then they're just sitting there with the ability to quarry but not actually proceeding.
Still permitted to go back?
Filling with water.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some interesting case law on that. They usually have to only pull a truckload out a year to keep it active.
And then we didn't address anything in Goal 4 about oil and gas particularly, and we did have some public comment that came forward about not so much the extraction of oil and gas as some of the injection wells that that companies use with that, and whether or not we have any say over if they're bringing in wastewater from other locations than outside of the county. And Jeff, did you have any thoughts about what may be within our rights? Much of that's set by the state.
Most of it's set by the federal government, actually, and then they'd
Okay.
involve it to the state. As my quick research in between Monday to now, which is by no means complete, is that we almost have no role in that aspect because the permitting's held up by either the Kansas Corporation Commission or with KDHE that is given down by the EPA. I'm still digging through to see what it is. I think the only role that we would have is the ability to comment inside of a comment window, and that would be a very tight 30-day window from what I'm reading on the permits.
Right.
So I'm not sure we really have much role in that aspect at this point, but we'll continue researching to find out more.
Okay.
But yeah, I was gonna say, if we can have an asterisk or something in there, because I don't wanna pass this on to city and county boards until we've gotten a finalized, I mean, your 5-minute read, I'm sure, is probably 95% accurate, but you never know.
It is a 5-minute read.
Right.
Can we direct Jeff to spend a little time looking to see if there might be any language that could be useful for us to kind of give some support to residents in the county that have been dealing with these issues?
There is a local group that's working on those issues, and this issue with the Kansas Corporation Commission is extremely problematic. Their testimony requirements and who can testify and all these other things are pretty much prohibitive of actually speaking there. But the group that Holcomb keeps referencing, Lettuce, they have a subgroup that's been working extensively on that. So they might be a source for some information, and I believe at least one of the county commissioners has a big interest in this. And if nothing else, it's probably, there's an aspiration that we want some control over it, and I think that's a legislative push that's far beyond what we can do, but it could be a a stated goal that we continue to look at possibilities to gain more local control over that through the legislative process, but that might be as far as we can go.
We have that in 6.10 of the chapter to kind of go to that angle. This originally came from Tonganoxie and the CAFO that was proposed up there, the confined feeding operation. But this is where 6.10 originated from. I think it kind of goes to that angle. We'll definitely take a peek at some of the other stuff and see what we can suss out.
Thank you. Does anyone have any other comments or suggestions on goal number 4? How about goal number 5?
Madam Chair?
Yes.
I have a couple comments on section 5.
Okay.
I'd like to suggest a bit of a change to 5.3 to start with, just because food waste is becoming a much bigger and bigger issue. I mean, we waste about 1/3, according to the latest USDA report, 1/3 of our food.
It's on the low end.
Yeah, I think it's an underestimate, all along the line. So I thought I'd suggest making that a standalone. And the language I'm suggesting is encourage composting, donation, and other efforts throughout Douglas County to reduce the amount of food deposited in landfills. So essentially just highlighting that one item, food. And then in terms of the original 5.3 mentions recycling materials out of landfills, and I would then suggest that we could rewrite 5.1 to say, manage solid waste by emphasizing reducing, reusing, and recycling across all households in Douglas County. I guess that would be in addition to the statement about across all industries in Douglas County. But I was trying to find a way to highlight the food waste.
And that is a big portion of, or it's certainly spoken to in the food policy document.
So maybe this is too short-sighted to things that are popping up in the news, but I might even suggest that we look at dropping households, and that in that way we infer households and businesses, or add the word and business, add the words and businesses to that, because
Institutions.
Yeah, we could add across all industries and households throughout
Yeah,
the county.
yeah.
Could do something like that. But I don't know if the industries, you wanted particularly that line item also set out. If you wanted to, one statement for industries, one statement for households, or combine them.
I would say if your recommendation is to split out the recycling from the composting, then we just keep all the recycling in one goal and all the composting in the other.
So households, industries, and institutions in line 5.1. And then, do you want a 5.4 that talks about food waste specifically, or do you want to incorporate it in 5.3?
That would just be a rewrite of 5.3. If we move the recycling and the concept of reducing amounts of materials to the landfill, if that moves up to 5.1, then 5.3 would just focus on food by saying encourage composting, donation, and other food and other efforts throughout Douglas County to reduce the amount of food deposited in
Okay.
landfills. We could mention food waste prevention in that list if we wanted to, or just leave it as other efforts.
Okay. Commissioner Payton.
Not to back up, but I'm going to, I think. One thing that came up a lot in the comments was talking about native plants and natives for using natives in our urban spaces even. And I know some of that may, like using natives falls under reclamation procedures, so may not necessarily be needed there. But we also talk about in some spots, like 2.9, protect native ecosystems by addressing invasive species with priority given to non-chemical methods. But I feel like that's been omitted. I thought I read somewhere something about using natives, but now I can't find it. So I don't know if it's in another chapter and I'm just missing it, like they talk about it in open space or something. But I feel like that's something that's been omitted. And so I don't know if there is a place we can add.
Would it fit in the urban environment in goal 6?
Maybe, I thought about that. But I don't think it's just for urban environment. I just don't know where it would fit otherwise. So maybe something along the lines of,
Or in land resources, in goal 2, is that where you'd rather see it?
I think it probably makes more sense there. Maybe.
In a 2.10, is that what we're up to?
Yeah. Under, it would probably make sense under protect native
We're up to
ecosystem,
211?
so.
212,
Use,
212.
use, are we on 212?
If my,
We are.
I think it's 212.
Well, you're with
No, I think he's right, because we took out.
You added one Monday.
What did we add Monday?
Oh, don't ask him to review.
Promote ag practices that mitigate erosion and improve soil health.
I was
for
just
future-
wondering if we had added this one
And you're right, there was quite a bit in public comment about making sure that that's spelled out. So are you proposing for a, do you have some language to propose for
I didn't
goal number 2?
particularly, but maybe I think there may be several places it could be used, but if we could just, if it makes sense to put, you know, I guess I'm wondering if it, you know, we want a general, you know, use native species, generally when we can, like, for instance, under, proper extraction and remediation, you know, you want to see natives there. For land resources like in parks, but also when we can encourage it in other places, so I don't really know. If just a couple of words need to be added to a few things, or?
If you'd like, we could take a look at that through the style guide and syntax we've developed for the plan and try to generate something to bring back.
Okay.
I think it could probably be something as easy as you encourage the use of native plants. Just encourage the use of native plants. I mean, and then certainly that has more power over city and
Yeah.
county type entities, but also feeds into education and that sort of thing. Is that too simple?
So
Too direct?
12, encourage the use of native plants. Okay.
Do we have that proposed for a 2.12? Does that have some general consensus?
Madam Chair, I'm sorry, I didn't know we were done with the last one. Can I clarify some points on
The
that?
last one, what?
Food waste?
Food waste.
Oh, okay, sorry.
I didn't know we settled on exact language on that. So could you say it one more time?
My proposal for 5.3 is to encourage composting, donation, and other efforts throughout Douglas County to reduce the amount of food deposited in landfills.
Okay,
And I believe someone else
then
on the
you had a-
commission had a good summary of 5.1.
I have for 5.1 is down 4 is manage solid waste by emphasizing reducing, reusing, and recycling across all industries, households, and institutions.
Sounds good.
but you had mentioned something about putting composting up in 5.1 as well, no? Okay.
I think, because we struck recycling from 5.3, leaving 5.1 to be the one place where we're talking about recycling. I think that was the intent,
So there's nothing about composting now?
right? Any other thoughts on 5, on goal number 5?
Households and institutions.
Says to goal number 6, the urban environment, which is a fairly long one.
I have a comment, Madam
Go
Chair,
ahead.
just on the very beginning.
Mhm.
Because I believe we recommended renaming the chapter to Environment and Natural Resources, at the beginning description of the last sentence, efforts to improve the urban environment can serve to protect and sustain our environment and natural resources, just to match the title. because we're not just talking about.
Okay. It has natural environment, urban environment, and environment all in the same heading. Does that bother anybody? We'll just say Jeff wrote it. Does that sound okay? So environment and natural resources. The goal number 6, strengthen environmental protection through sustainable development of the built urban environment. Any comments on that for wording? How about 6.1?
I have a comment on that one.
Okay.
Adopt a climate change adaptation and mitigation plan, I would suggest. So adopt a climate change adaptation and mitigation plan, incorporating potential climate change scenarios and identifying specific actions to reduce greenhouse gases and reduce risk and exposure from hazards.
Okay. I had some similar thoughts, and that was just striking adaptation and making it an action plan, which kind of has both aspects in it, but I think your wording gets to the same thing. So adaptation and mitigation plan, and then adding greenhouse gas in addition to risk and exposure from hazards. People feel all right about that?
I like adding the mitigation because we're talking about different
Mhm.
types of approaches with that.
Mhm.
I
Right.
think we need to have both.
Mhm.
I think it's good to have the wording for both in there.
Okay.
Question for staff.
Sure.
So, Mr. Almond had some different suggested language in here, but my question's about his references. The climate protection plan and peak oil response plan. Are those official city documents? I mean, I know they're on the website. There are reports to the Lawrence City Commission, and then one is from the mayor's, the peak oil plan, Lawrence Mayor's Peak Oil Task Force.
Yeah, they're both, the Climate Protection Task Force reports was adopted in 2009.
Right.
The peak oil response plan was adopted in 2011. So, yeah,
Right, right.
They're both referenced into the document under reference plans.
Okay, so the reference plans.
Correct.
But has anything been done with them? Have we implemented any of the recommendations, or?
I think we'd have to look back. I mean, I think several things have come out of some of the concepts, including a whole department now of sustainability,
Okay.
for example. We look at much more through the lens of climate protection,
Minus the
sustainability,
8-year-old
energy
recommendations?
codes, and, yeah. As I recall, in many of the peak oil issues were less about, I mean, there's clearly a land use component and connection there
Right.
with transportation and land use and those sorts of things. There were also several non-land use related items in there.
Do we have any comments on 6.2? Noise and light pollution? 6.3?
Actually, could I get an example of mitigate impacts caused by noise and light pollution and development activities? Like, for instance, light pollution, are there any specific?
There's some very specific.
Yeah, this really relates pretty directly to our development code
Mm-hmm.
and the standards we have in our development code. We don't go as far as some communities that have dark night sky ordinances, for
Mhm.
example, which I think what we're saying is either maintain or enhance our codes related to these issues.
Six point four, multimodal.
I'm not sure if it's redundant, but I would suggest adding the word interconnected to the multimodal transportation plan. A sustainable, interconnected, multimodal transportation system.
6.5,
I just have a question
Sure.
about that. So the key word here in 6.5 is promote sustainable building practices. But I did notice that in 2020, there is the language in the 2020 plan is that the city and county shall take the lead in reducing energy consumption. So is that a downgrade? Is that,
I think it goes back to we purposefully didn't want to get into a shall-should argument in this plan, and so we chose not to use that primarily. So I don't know that it's a downgrade, because I think we do lead in that, and I think this helps us keep leading in that, so. Yeah, the word shall usually is used in code
right?
versus
So that I wasn't sure how it
aspirational
was-
kind of goals. That was our decision anyway for not using it.
Any other comments on 6.5, or do you have any changes, Commissioner Ashworth, that you were recommending with it, or you?
No, I just would hope that when we get to the coding part, that there would be a few more shalls in there.
There are many.
6.6. I'm not sure that I want to recommend changing it, but I did want to. So enhancing our current building codes for energy efficiency, I mean, we use some standard set of building codes
We do.
for the community. And they're very strict on energy efficiency, to the point where at some point we need to start talking about indoor air quality, because the houses are so tight, they do not release moisture and can start to have a detrimental effect on the house structure and its lifespan. I don't know that we really need to enhance the building codes for our energy efficiency, or just to keep up with the building codes, because the building codes themselves get revised and reviewed, and energy efficiency is already quite a strong point in that. There's also the affordability part, that our building codes, the stronger they get, the more expensive our housing gets, and we don't always get a return on that investment for our housing overall. So I think there's a balance there, and this 6.6 doesn't necessarily allow for that. Crickets. That's what
I can
would say.
respond. I can respond. The points you bring up, I would argue, are debatable, but I can see the perspective. I think, though, what this is getting to is we don't know what's on the horizon, technology speaking, and it allows us, to take, solar panels, for example, have evolved into a really much more efficient system than they were 30 years ago. And so it allows us to take advantage of some technology that may be different than the points you're bringing up, maybe a win-win for everybody, maybe a cheap way to do it, a big payoff, and not harm a structure.
Well, that's not energy efficiency when we're talking about building codes. The
Well,
solar
it
panels
is,
would
if
be
we
separate.
require a new technology through the codes, it could be a way to enhance the building codes to make it a requirement.
Would be energy generation, but when they talk about energy efficiency, they're talking about the how much it takes to heat, which frankly, a smaller home would be more efficient. I mean, there's ways to get efficiency without technology too.
Right. Again, we're not trying to be too detailed in our
Okay.
aspirational goals, and if you've got some changes there, I would argue that for the last several years, there's been a desire, looking at the building codes as a mechanism to create energy efficiency. You may have some upfront costs that are realized better by the consumer from the affordability issue. Like your statement about, well, it may not pay off, but it may, that's debatable. Whether or not a structure is harmed, I've heard the other side of that story, that the tighter you make it, actually, because there's a requirement now that you mechanically bring in different rounds of air every hour, that you're actually breathing, the house is breathing more. So that's why I mentioned that, all those points are debatable. But the idea is that we're using our codes to increase energy efficiency of the home. It could be as simple as requiring Energy Star ratings, which we have done on certain projects, which is the use of energy, not the creation of energy, for example.
Okay. Well, I sounds like we'll leave the language as it is.
I was just going to, if I may, just, instead of saying to increase energy efficiency, to incorporate new technology. I mean, if the point is, because we already address responsible use and conservation of energy.
Well, and I mean, you could even strike anything to do with the building codes and just say promote responsible use and conservation of energy and natural resources in new construction and significant
There you
remodels.
go.
Because, building codes is just one means to the end. It's not the only means to the end.
Yeah.
So,
Everything between by and,
and to,
everything after natural resources and before
New,
construction. Jump.
Okay.
yeah, for new construction and significant.
okay.
Is that better?
I don't know that I agree that we should take to increase energy efficiency out. But
Just the building
Well,
codes
yeah.
portion?
Sure,
I mean-
that would work
Yeah.
too.
How often does the city review and update the building code?
Currently, it's every 3 years. We're
And
talking about a 6-year cycle.
is that as the new national standards increase? And each one of those incorporates the newer technology?
Yeah, but energy is there are some local amendments surrounding energy efficiency in our code anyway.
And the county doesn't use the same code that the city does.
Correct.
Never
Which
have.
raises another issue. What's this addressing? I mean, if we say this, is we sending two different messages, one to the city and one to the county?
If we take out the part about current building codes, then it's applied equally to both. Does that language work for everybody? We're just striking by enhancing current building codes and leaving the rest of the content in place. Does that sound okay?
Yes.
6.7. Six point eight.
I have a suggestion for 6.8.
Okay.
And an explanation for why. My suggestion for 6.8 is develop strategies for enhancing energy conservation in existing housing stock and promote adaptive reuse of existing structures. And by enhancing energy conservation in existing housing stock, I mean sort of incentives, education, and possibly related to 6.10 in terms of supporting state legislation. I know there's been in the past promoted something called PACE, I can't remember what it stands for, but it's a ability for homeowners to get, I think it's reduction on loans in order to put energy, to insulate their homes.
Not that familiar
No.
with.
I'm afraid I didn't have time to dig in and figure out what that was. But it was a way of basically forgiving some loans, forgiving some taxes if a homeowner were to increase their insulation, increase the energy efficiency of their home. And it's something that has to be done at the state levels, apparently not something we can do here. But just thinking, because I read 6.10 and you have a support state legislation phrase in there, I thought maybe that could be applied for enhancing energy conservation in existing housing stock. Finding ways to help homeowners do that.
Can you read your statement one more time, Commissioner?
Develop strategies for enhancing energy conservation in existing housing stock and promote adaptive reuse of existing structures.
I thought those were two separate concepts to me, the adaptive reuse. I like your wording in the beginning, and I would I wondered if adaptive reuse of existing structures wasn't a different concept entirely.
It certainly could be. The idea is that you don't want to just tear it down and start over, I think, is one concept there. I think strategies for energy conservation in existing housing stock could be something without changing use. So I do agree those could be two different issues. So you want us to separate those?
I would recommend separating them.
That's fine.
Is housing stock the only kind of building that we want that first part to apply to? Building?
I was just making it as a difference between new construction,
Oh, I
and
see.
so it's just,
Uh-huh.
instead of just applying energy efficiency to new
Oh, I
construction,
see.
that maybe there's something that can be done to
Existing.
enhance, encourage
Mhm.
in our existing building stock, maybe,
Yeah,
or.
you could just say in existing buildings.
Okay.
You know.
Fewer words.
Well, and I think we don't, I assume this is applicable to buildings regardless of whether or not they're residential, this goal.
Yes.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think it'd be good to have it open-ended.
Okay, so we have 6.8 split into two separate topics, and we have Commissioner Ashworth's language on the first one. And the second one, just, develop strategies of adaptive reuse or encourage adaptive reuse? What,
I think promote adaptive reuse
that'll work?
of existing structures.
Okay. Any other comments on that one? Comfortable with that? 6.9,
I had a question on that one. Does the best management practices apply to existing stormwater infrastructure?
Existing stormwater, I mean, it could if it were being redeveloped. Is that the question, or?
I get, so I would assume that utilizing green infrastructure to manage stormwater would probably be on new development? Or at least that's how I read it, and then the best management practices to manage stormwater would be on existing stormwater infrastructure?
I think that too is mostly for new development. That's when we can employ it. You're not typically going in and retrofitting,
Right.
once it's in the ground, once it's there.
we'll use it as long as we can. Should we say something about new construction or new developments?
I'd like to hear other people's opinions on that. I'm maybe thinking that way, but I don't have any sample language.
Finish your thought.
No, it was the question, because if we're referring to, we've got sections of the city that have wastewater management, or that have stormwater infrastructure that's quite aged. And so if we're going to, I wanted to find out if there was a purposeful differentiation between future development, stormwater goals, and rehabbing, improving existing stormwater infrastructure.
I think this wording leaves it open and more open and flexible. I think in practice, what you'll find is it may be difficult to, stormwaters are connected. So if you've got a pipe in the ground from here to there, to the river, it's gonna be hard to, and some cities have brought up things up to the surface again, done some green infrastructure, and then back down it goes. But this leaves it at least open to consider those things, in my opinion.
But that requires that there's the space to do that.
It does, it requires all kinds of things,
Yeah.
but if we've got a policy that says at least consider it,
Right.
then that's good.
Because it is possible, I imagine, on major road overhauls, when you're really tearing up the curb and gutter, there's something else you can do.
Yeah, there was a component of this, for example, in the 9th Street corridor project where we were looking at some green infrastructure there as a redeveloped streetscape.
I had,
KU does it.
But Burroughs Creek is a
Or
good
Jayhawk.
example of bringing things
Yeah.
up to a higher standard when they went through and changed that whole drainage area and widened it. And now they're working on restoring some native plants into, it's really fun to watch. I wish they'd quit mowing it, but,
I'm sure we got a complaint today that it's not mowed short enough.
Yeah, but it's a different type of, I think, so put up a sign, this is a drainage wetland, you know, and we aren't mowing it, so.
It's pretty fun
So
to see
don't
that
ask.
in flow too. So if you haven't, go over there during a storm. I'm
Mhm.
sure you've seen that plenty of times.
Also on this topic about green infrastructure, I've had some conversations with the folks in the Sustainability Office that they were wanting to kind of conduct a comprehensive review of the code for these unintended barriers to green infrastructure. That's something that came out of the APA conference last year, the national conference. One of the talks that I went to, and there was a handbook that came with that for how to kind of, go through the code in your own communities and look at that. So is that something that we can put in the implementation portion, or does that need to be spelled out here to kind of say, we'd like to conduct a comprehensive review of the code for unintended barriers to green infrastructure?
I think that would be probably a next step down. I think 6.9 kind of sets you up for that one, because it may be an evaluation that we go deeper and be more involve with subject matter experts than the comp plan level.
So wouldn't fall into this at all, but if they were to conduct that, then they could say, well, underneath, that it falls under something from the comp plan. Do they need direction from the comp plan in order to do that work?
No, it would need direction. It could be a part of the scope as it comes down to kind of carry out those best management practices and to, kind of look at those best management practices and just evaluate what is the barriers and what would be involved in that one.
But you don't think it would fall under the implementation chapter on that item? Because that is something really tangible that they can
It
work
could.
on that would, okay,
I mean,
I'd
I
like to
think
see that.
It could, but it's interesting how you framed it in terms of reduce the barriers. Makes it seem like it's not gonna be required. We're just gonna reduce and I can say that when we are confronted with developers who want to use green infrastructure, we do what we can to accommodate. Waivers, support variances, whatever the case may be. An example is that our code requires curb and gutters for parking lots. Well, that doesn't accommodate sometimes rain
Swales
gardens,
and,
where you want it to sheet flow off of the parking lot into the gutter and then flow to a more focused point. So there have been a few examples where we have accommodated that through variances to our code. But that accommodates it. It doesn't require it. So there's a difference in my mind on whether we want the policy to mandate it or, pursue incorporating green infrastructure for stormwater green infrastructure in our codes. Could be a different policy altogether, which would be a clear expectation in the policy and then a clear sort of action step in the implementation chapter.
So you're saying add another line item
If
in
that's your
here?
intent, I would add a policy.
I think they are separate, or at least would be a subset of it, so.
Yeah, because to me, again, I think about public versus private development a lot. And when I see 6.9, I think that not only do we want to accommodate the private sector utilizing best management practices, we want to lead in that as well. Or do we want to mandate it? That may be a different topic.
Well, and the language that I put in here, it came out of, part of that discussion was that that's what they did for the urban ag, was that they had to go through the code and find all the ways in which it was intentionally or unintentionally not allowed. So some things were direct and intentionally not allowed, but other things were just kind of these unintended barriers. And so that was language that I took out of that discussion and something that they thought that they were wanting to move forward with anyway. So I guess I'd recommend then, what you're saying is to have it be a separate line item with language similar to what I have on the screen.
So, let's see. Yes, if you're wanting to accommodate, or if you're looking for a little bit stronger language to incorporate, green because I see what you're doing here, but that just breaks the barriers down. It doesn't
encourage, that's
It
why
doesn't
I thought we were making
encourage-
it separate from 2.9.
Yeah. So, if you wanted to strengthen it, you could say something like, you could keep even something similar to this and add to, and incorporate green infrastructure practices and codes into the cities and counties' codes or something. I don't know. I'm struggling myself a little bit.
That sounds pretty eloquent, let's use that.
Strengthen it up.
Can't remember.
And you're replacing then 6.9 with that language.
I
Or
would
not?
keep that
Okay,
as well, or maybe it's work it into one.
okay.
If you give us permission to work on that one a little bit, we certainly will.
I think they could be separate, and then we could move on.
Okay. Yeah, not right now, but
Okay.
later we could work on some of
Okay.
that language.
And I used the same language for a suggested 6.11, which was conduct a comprehensive review of the code for unintended barriers to rooftop solar.
Do you want to be so specific with the rooftop solar, or do we want to broaden it to say?
Distributed energy.
I think we want to
Long-term.
broaden it, distributed energy generation, is that what you?
Well, that, I mean, you asked about specifics, but what's with the language that's used up in, which one was the distributed energy already?
That's so far back, that was
Said
Monday.
something about distributed energy in here. There it is,
6.5?
6.5.
Yeah.
It wasn't.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
So maybe the language, the code review could fall under, or after 6.5. And be not just rooftop solar, but distributed energy.
So is it duplicative, I think is the question, or does 6.5 cover it?
I think there needs to be an effort made to look at the code for, because we've built in a certain way for a long time, and the technology now exists that we can accommodate, but we don't always, because sometimes our code is asking for things that both can't happen at the same time.
Can I ask an only mildly related question? In neighborhoods that have covenants on building materials for roofs, for instance, or in neighborhood associations, if there are restrictions on use of rooftop solar, do those covenants and neighborhood association restrictions
Looking at you.
hold true?
Can we clarify that term? You're speaking of homeowners associations?
Well, I'm sorry, what did I
Usually
say?
have covenants. Most of the neighborhood associations, they don't have covenants. It's
What did I
homeowners
say? Neighborhood? I meant
associations
homeowners
and-
associations. Yeah, sorry, thank you for that.
But I don't know. That's a conflict. Like, well, one that happened in Lawrence is certain neighborhood homeowners associations required shake shingles.
Absolutely.
And then the city said, no, those are going, and they're gone. So that's one case that, when it came down to public safety, the city was able to use, through the police powers, overrule specific covenants for the safety of the community as a whole.
Yeah.
Others, like rooftop solar, I don't know that that's been tested. But there are cases out there about you're blocking my light and things like that. So I don't know where that would come down. I just don't think it's been tested adequately yet to know what the outcome would be to go in that direction. But if it can be, directly tied to the police powers of, public safety and welfare, yes. Now, if we can declare
Rooftop solar to be a.
energy a city emergency or something, but we don't want to go into emergency powers right now.
It's really fact-based, Depends on if your HOA is active and they've got
Sure.
money to litigate and all that.
And
But
the
it's-
signees for covenants
but it's a
for
civil matter
developments.
Mostly, we don't look at HOA, I mean, they have to meet our standards for us to approve the permit, and then they have to meet the HOA if they're active, and they review it.
So would that be a scenario in which a comprehensive review of the code for creating unintended barriers for distributed generation of power, would that be a situation where that would apply?
I think the best that would come of that is if somebody wanted to put in solar and they had a covenant, a restrictive covenant, it would give them some, something to stand on as an argument that the city is promoting this, whether that would have any success or not.
We would issue the permit,
Yeah.
and then they would have to go
They'd
through a
have to go
civil
fight
suit
it.
with their HOA with it.
I think you might have more trouble with wind generation and homeowners associations for wanting to put up a small wind generator or something. And a lot of
Yeah.
homeowners associations don't allow poles, flag poles, and that sort of thing.
I like the language I like the language of your proposed 6.11, if we just make the modification and broaden it, because
So we're getting several sort of these review the codes for this and that. And part of me thinks that we're getting off the theme in our policies of being sort of broad and aspirational versus what we do in the implementation stage. So I offer that comment. The other thing is that, Madam Chair, are you hearing that there are barriers in the code, or speaking of the county or the city code? We do an awful lot of rooftop permits for solar. Is that-
I'm thinking more for commercial and industrial than home. And I think there are barriers in the code that could be identified. But I certainly think this could go in the implementation portion and not rise to the level of getting too far in the weeds with the main points.
And there is still the avenue of getting a variance from the Board of Zoning Appeals for some of this. The Zarco station at, what is it, 9th and Iowa, that
Has a little spinny do.
wind generation on top came through the Board of Zoning Appeals when I was on it to get a variance so they could put that in there. So those opportunities exist also.
They're hairier than if somebody looked through the code and worked on.
Yeah, they're hairier, but there are some avenues. I mean, we can have an aspiration here. And I think given that this is something that the city as a whole or the county as a whole is striving to achieve, again, it gives your argument greater weight if you request one of these other ways to do it until somebody figures out code language that might work for everything. Because it's so hard. I mean, some things will work in some parts and they won't work in other parts of
So-
town.
Can I make a suggestion in 6.5? We talk about promoting building practices by creating incentives. What if we added and reducing barriers
There you go.
to improve opportunities?
I like it.
Ooh, good job, Scott. How mad is?
Commissioner Ashworth.
Just keep talking.
I'll wait for this, but this discussion that we just had about bringing things back to code makes me bring up a general question, and I apologize, being the new person. But several people on Monday, in the comments we've been getting from the public, with this concern about what's happening with the detail and general code. So my question is, so what is the timeframe that we're talking about when we have these aspirational goals in 2040? How and when does it actually then get interpreted into the code? So, because from what I understood from some comments was that some of the stuff that was in 2020, aspirations, goals, policies, never made it into the code,
true.
even decades on. So my general question is, what are we talking here when we're working on the aspirational goals here, but then we really want to see things in the land development code?
It's a good question, and it's going to depend on a lot of things. Our workload each year is driven by a number of factors. The work the planning commission wants to accomplish, the work the city commission, the county commission, they're all lobbied by neighborhood associations, by development groups, by all kinds of people to get things on the list. So, we have to each year sort of look at all of those issues, and I have in years past, I haven't the last couple of years because this has been our primary focus, I have usually brought to the planning commission and both governing bodies a proposed work plan. It takes a different form now that we're going to have an implementation kind of chapter to do that, but one of the things on the work plan is work on the implementation of P2040, right? And that will include recommended list of code changes or programs, and it may not be us, it may be the Sustainable Advisory Board has a work item out of that, or food policy has a couple of items out of that. And so we'll try to do that as well. But essentially, you will be a participant in directing the planning office in their annual work plan. But you will be a participant, not the decider of things mostly, because there are other inputs to that. So I hope that answers some of the question.
Thank you.
It's a little messy, and sometimes in the middle of the year, we get a new priority, and so we don't get to that priority, and that has happened probably more often than next. It's what's the priority of the month this month that puts that in the back burner. We've been wanting to get to lighting standards, stormwater, stream corridor efforts, those kind of things for years, and higher priorities always intervene, and so that's what keeps us busy. So,
Including writing a comp plan. It's
Including
taken up
writing a brand
a
new
little
comp-
of staff time,
Yeah.
right? That brings us to 6.10, and we've talked about it a little bit. It's that support state legislation giving local governments more authority to mitigate the potential environmental harm of large-scale agricultural and energy industries. Do we have any changes to that language?
I'd like to know what's meant by large-scale agricultural.
CAFO.
Is
Yeah.
that what we're talking about, industrial?
yes.
CAFOs is what I said.
Confined animal feeding operations.
Well, why don't we just say that?
We
Because it may be
probably,
something else.
well, I think the guys farming 3,000 acres are gonna worry if it's them. So I
They
think
could.
maybe it should be reworded, if that's,
That was what I'm getting to. Are we just talking about somebody that's got large-scale commodity crop, or are we actually talking about the CAPO? Because I'm sure this is coming out of the Tyson issue and such.
Why not just stop it at harm? Support state legislation giving local governments more authority to mitigate potential environmental harm.
Because I think this was trying to give us support for that one issue.
For the very specific
For
issue.
a couple of issues that we don't have, that we thought was a high enough harm to include it in the comp plan.
Okay, but now we seem to be stepping on either side of the line with specificity.
This is.
And that's fine,
We could
because it
argue
depends
that.
on
We could
who's
argue
reading the
that.
document as far as where I think we should be more specific, where someone else thinks we ought to be more specific, but we are kind of,
Yeah, I don't disagree.
This one, I believe, is pretty much county commission generated, which is at least the county commission representation to the steering committee is kind of where this came from.
okay.
So it's more of a county issue, and I don't mind having the specificity there because I think there's really kind of think it would be useful to have in their legislative efforts with Topeka.
would you support changing the language from large-scale agricultural to CAFO?
I would, because I think that's pretty much directly on board, and I think the energy is talking about wind farms and a couple of other interesting things that have come through
Injection
here.
wells.
The oil and gas,
Yes,
yeah.
and the
That
wells.
one.
That's what's driving 6.10 to even be here in the first place.
I don't disagree with any of that, I'm just,
I
I
understand.
mean, why not account for things that we have no idea about yet?
Well,
I do think that term, large-scale agricultural, that's a scary, that's gonna scare
Oh.
some people to say,
Yeah.
okay.
But if you're saying that it was specific and targeted by the county commission, I don't want to rewrite their
it's a type of
suggestion.
activity, and those are the specific examples right now. So I
Right.
think, it's kind of be more inclusive. I mean, it can be used more inclusively, but say such as CAPO, injection wells, or whatever we want to add to the list at the end of this, which gets tacked on to probably by both the city and the county commission, but
Is that how you wanna deal with it, was with the list of,
I think such
Such
as, yeah, because I think this is really one that's in there to target
Yeah.
some specific identified potential problems, because, especially coming out of what was going to be happening by Tonganoxie, since we were in the feeder area to that plant.
So is there a way to accomplish both where we say, support state legislation giving local governments more authority to mitigate potential environmental harm?
harms such as,
Yes, such as.
and then CAPO will have to have a hyperlink or something for a definition, because not everybody's familiar with that
We would
term.
just say confined animal feeding
Okay,
operations.
that works.
Because when you say, and I know we're starting to get into the semantics of it, but I think the such as tips the cap to having the specific motivation behind that bullet, but then also making things broad enough to account for things that
It's not
we
an
don't know about.
exclusive list when
Right.
you use the term such as.
So we have such as confined animal feeding operations, injection wells, and are you wanting to also have wind farms? We just spoke in terms of distributed generation.
What was that other one with the blowing the,
Oh, that was the test
Geothermal?
for wind.
yeah. I mean, that had some opposition show up to.
Yeah, that was energy industries.
Right,
Yeah,
okay.
so energy industries, if we do the such as, then that knocks that out, and you have to rephrase it.
It could just be energy industries.
Such as.
And I don't know
Energy
the such as on that
industries
one.
Does adding the word new or proposed make any, or mitigate the concern from existing operators?
It may well.
So, new large-scale agriculture, or new,
That still feels problematic to me,
Okay.
yeah. Because every time you add land, you're now a newer, larger agricultural entity. So, you want to try the language again with your such as and your energy industries?
I'm better with the agricultural part than I
Uh-huh.
am with listing the energy ones, but,
So, environmental harms from energy industries, and we can't get our such as in that way.
You don't have to have a ton, just say such as, what is it, CAPO?
well, we got.
CAPO, comma, injection wells, comma,
And there's-
maybe think of one more?
There's
Threes are
also
good.
the issue around Baldwin right now of, in front of the Kansas Corporation Commission about whether oil leases expired or have not expired over time, and people ending up with oil wells in their front yard with no choice in the matter.
And leaving it open to energy industries, I think, covers all of that.
And I think maybe we put some examples for agriculture, but the energy industry is mostly, it's a lot more of outside interests. Well, so is CAPO,
Yeah.
but, I don't know, now I'm all confused.
Does it read weird, though, if you specify one thing and then make a very general one right next to it?
Let's try this. Mitigate the potential environmental harm of energy industries and CAFOs. pretty specific.
Or just leave it with two, just with one example of the ag and one example of industry, and the such
Yeah.
as picks up
Everything
anything
else.
else that comes up.
I like
Okay.
the such as because it's broader.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, well, yes, without,
We have
without
so-
all the extra words. Yeah.
So
He's
far,
really good at building code. You really are.
Let us do it.
so we have such as CAFOs and injection wells.
Yeah.
That's what we have so far.
Let's leave it at that.
But are we taking out the large-scale agriculture?
Yes.
Yes.
Then what is such as, like, qualifying?
We're taking out energy industries also, so it's just such as CAFOs and injection
Yeah, but what is
wells.
such as?
Oh, from
Harms?
Oh, yeah.
Harm of
large
something
scale,
such as.
large scale
No,
activities such
There you
as,
go.
large scale activities such as CAFOs
Okay.
and injection wells.
Anything we don't currently have authority over, so.
Right? Yeah.
Like telecommunications.
Support state legislature,
Right.
that's more thing. Why not? Just come out and say it.
Are we overstepping our bounds so far, or should we keep going?
Randy left, so.
Well, I'm wondering if it can't be more generalized with some such as, with two or three such ases that talks about mitigate the potential environmental harm of certain industries such as CAFOs, injection wells, oil
Just
wells.
Stop right there with the two. And the catch-all phrase of such all will get the rest, or whatever piques the attention of the county commission at the time.
But are you saying, Scott, then, I'm sorry, can you give me the proposed language on 610 again then?
To mitigate the potential environmental harm of industries such as CAFOs and injection wells.
Do you want to take out large scale, or is that still?
It's out. Is it, or do you
I
say
think I can live
large-scale
with that.
industries?
I
Is
think
that
I
what you
can live
have?
with that.
Okay, yeah.
Well, it said large-scale agriculture,
Yeah, but we took that out, right?
Oh, I see.
but if you take that out, you're left with
I see.
industries.
Industries
And what
such
is
as-
industry but an economic activity? It doesn't necessarily mean an industrial activity, just, yeah.
CAFOs aren't all huge operations.
No,
They may
it's
be
true.
10 head. That's a CAFO. May not be regulated, but it's a confined feeding operation.
Which, and everybody's got that,
Is that the
especially this winter.
Yep.
And we will
Well,
endeavor to mitigate the harm of those as well.
Maybe we go back to large-scale CAFOs, I don't know, we have to set a limit, I'm not sure, because that is, I'm not sure about the definition if, I mean, if a home feedlot
Jeff says it depends
covers.
on your animal.
Yeah, the state law
What the
defines a
definition
CAFO very specifically depending on the animal you have, the area, and then how much is going on around it. So limiting to a CAFO could be, depending on the animal, 10 or 10,000, depending upon what it is, and then what your procedure is for handling of the animal.
And honestly, in weather like this, confining them is the best use because of the impact on the land. So temporary confinements usually are, I'm sure they're not regulated, but they're spelled out differently, I thought.
Yeah, it's like difference between, I'm just kind of going through here, difference between swine, poultry, beef. I'm going to assume that's another category. So it just depends on how many and what you have going on. It really kind of gets into it. And the state has a very specific
They do.
definition for when it triggers a confined animal feeding op.
So we're definitely getting in the weeds when we start talking about number of animals and such.
The-
And I don't want to,
If it kind of helps, the intent with this, I think when the steering committee kind of came up with this language, wasn't necessarily aimed at a farmer with 3,000 acres who's doing a beef operation or something like that. It was really aimed more at towards your, I might go on a limb and kind of your industrial agriculture or your corporate agricultural holdings and those kind of things where you have those kind of wide swaths with the high turnover operations, not necessarily just a family farmer who's working through a beef operation.
and
So if we go, so then we're still at the point where if we keep it general and just stop at mitigate potential environmental harm, period, are we still honoring what the steering committee put together.
May I offer some language that I think does honor it? Starting from the beginning.
The very beginning?
Support state legislation giving local governments more authority to mitigate the potential environmental harm of certain uses, such as your list, not currently regulated by the county or city. The idea is, we want some authority over it. That's really the crux of the policy.
But not, okay, so then the part at the end where it says not currently regulated by the county or city.
Not
would-
currently able to be regulated or something.
Okay, so those would be, then that infers that those already are being regulated by the county or city.
Can we,
not.
can we maybe hit this, that there are things that are regulated by the state, so the size of a CAFO, by the time it triggers, that it has to go through KDHE, that's what we want to regulate. We don't want to touch the family farms and what they're doing. So, but that's pretty specific for what we're talking about here, but it does get at what the intent was. And the intent is to have some authority over those feedlots that are big enough to have the attention of the state. Though, it's possible some family farms meet that threshold too. Do they?
You're
They
right
don't-
back to
they do,
large-scale
don't they?
agriculture.
Yeah.
But how we regulate it, you know, in the future is a separate item.
It is,
The
but.
point of this policy is we want to lobby the state for some home rule authority.
Yes.
That's what we're trying to get at. Once we get that authority, we'll figure out what to do with it. But we don't even have the authority.
Yeah.
So that was the point of this. So, and if you know, a year ago, I didn't know injection wells in chicken farms existed to the level they do. So I won't know a year from now what else gets added to this such as list. So if we keep it with the such as list, that'll give us some opportunity in the year from now to say, oh, and also, you know, giant helium balloons or something. I don't know.
What do they ever farm next?
but-
Can we leave it as that, something like that, that we will continue to lobby for home rule, lobby the state and support legislation that allows for home rule, and leave everything else out of it, knowing that we can use those things as need be if we can get those rights from the state. But this is just saying that we're going to work with, you know, with legislation that's in the state.
Again, I do think there's an expectation that something along the lines of hitting these specific issues, such as list,
Right,
comes with this plan.
right.
Can you put large scale in front of environmental harm?
Good.
I mean, does that not, without listing those, because you start listing the CAFO, and you're gonna have
Yeah.
some guys in rubber boots in here making a mess of the floor.
And I might be one of
We
them.
don't want
And I'll
that.
be one of them. I mean, you're looking at large scale problems, I think, and not, instead of a
Yeah.
family farm operation. And
Except if you've got a new oil well in front of your house,
Well-
it's a small scale, but it's big to you, so.
True.
I'm sorry, because I liked everything else you said.
That's why I go back to, we just hit a period after harm. Mitigate potential environmental harm.
And I understand that the county commission has asked for,
Right.
for CAFOs specifically to be addressed. But I think how we address that is really going to matter. So I would say, in the same way that we've tasked Jeff with coming up with some, to see what other language we might be able to have around oil and gas, I think maybe we put the period after harm, this point, and then also look into, you know, what are ways that we can address that without, and have it targeted to what we actually care about, and not overstepping that and scaring people that have a livelihood that they may see themselves in that list whether we do or not.
Can I ask what's scary about being on the list?
Scary about being.
If you think Douglas County, so if you live in southwest Douglas County, you don't want Lawrence having any authority over you whatsoever. And to have a body of people sitting in town in City Hall to say, we're going to decide what you can and cannot do because we've decided you're large-scale agriculture, that's what that says.
City
That's,
Hall can't do it. It would be the county commission.
It's the perception that, and the county commission also meets in Lawrence. It's just, there's a cultural divide there, and we have to honor that and use language that is getting at what we intend to, but not overstepping.
Yeah, and, you know, it really does matter more for the county. And I'm not saying that it doesn't matter also to the city being inside the county, but it really is it is a management and regulatory concern that trends more toward the county. So I agree 100% with what you're saying on making sure that.
And I'm happy to work back through county commissioners and talk about what that language could maybe be, and we bring that back. Because otherwise, we'd be like done with this chapter.
But it's still early.
So, yeah, we don't have to make a motion yet.
Just out of curiosity, instead of local governments, does it make sense to say county governments? Or the county?
Lawrence still has urban farming. I mean, it's still got industry within it that could make potential environmental harm.
To 75% of the population of the county, which is in the city. So.
Cell phone towers.
You looking at CAFOs?
Just exploring options.
Yeah, but there's industries that could be revealed to have potential harm in the future. that
We're
the
not
city
allowed to
would need
discuss
to
the potential
also
harm of
regulate.
cell phone towers.
No, we're not
Say
allowed
again?
to.
We're not allowed to discuss the potential
Oh,
harm
I
of
wasn't
cell phone
discussing, no, I was, such as, such as.
Such as.
So, Scott, did you want to address us?
I don't know. I'm thinking that the discussion is turning to like, small-scale environmental harm is okay, but once it reaches a certain
Yeah,
level,
I'm not
and
going
it's
that
okay in
way.
the name of agriculture, but agriculture should be exempt from, there's no reason why we should pull them into the environmental discussion. Let's just only deal with places we don't, things we don't want in the community. So I'm having a little trouble with the discussion in that regard, if that makes sense. Look, I've worked in agriculture communities most of my career, so I understand the protections that the ag community has in the state law. Is the world changing? Does that need to change in terms of environment? If we're saying, well, big development over here should do some environmental mitigation, should agriculture do some environmental mitigation? And I know I get scolded by all the farmers out there, but that's what I'm hearing the discussion right now. When in reality, a lot of the agricultural uses are exactly what's polluting the rivers and lakes and things like that. So we know that.
That's all very true. I'm also just trying to leave room to say, sometimes the best practice other than your yard, the soils are really saturated in Douglas County, and there's mud everywhere. And so having them out free-ranging, which in sometimes this time of year people would be doing, it's too much damage. It's actually less damage to pull them into a smaller area. So leaving room to not preclude best practices because of the way we wrote our language. So that's not to take away that agriculture has a huge impact environmentally, and that's true.
Yeah, and the more you concentrate the animals, the higher the risk of a point source pollution entering the waterway. So, there are balancing acts about what the future holds for agriculture when you're balancing this. But I don't think that's where we are now.
Right.
I just would like to have the language that, we have a identifier list that the county should be working to get home rule to explore options over these areas, and what can we do? Because right now our hands are tied, and
What you just said is interesting. Instead of being definitive to mitigate, to explore
Home rule.
addressing harm associated with these types of uses such as, or maybe that's more language that's what we really want to do.
My last,
Carter, you have to jump in, they're not gonna let you.
well, I'll try raising my hand and not. My last suggestion is changing large scale to high intensity, because that seems to be the type of activity. So you'd say of high intensity agricultural and industrial activities.
That seems pretty open.
Okay, in that case, I'm done making
Okay, sorry.
suggestions.
And in terms of.
I mean, there's going to be a problem from some perspective with every word, so I don't know.
And I think, I mean, a lot of this discussion, I wonder if it is the discussion that would need to be had at the later stage.
Right.
You know, I mean, we're not gonna be able to completely define what is and what isn't included now. It's gonna have to be something that's for the policymakers at some point when when the county or the city has the home rule authority to do so. And so I would
Right.
think that people, if there are farmers or people out there that are concerned about it, then maybe at that time they would be the voices that would need to be heard in that kind of discussion, as opposed to now. But I don't know.
So are you recommending that we leave this language in and leave it and then end it at harm? That we're just looking for more, to support legislation for home rule? And I think we can leave that open-ended beyond that. And the county commission may have something to say about that, but then they can also listen to this full discussion about why we didn't go specific. I think it's.
And I understand that. I think maybe a hybrid of what Scott was saying, and then the addition of high intensity could work. Just environmental harm of uses such as high intensity, CAFOs and, I don't know, injection wells. It just, and then if there are issues, we could say we're not shooting for, a family farm. We're shooting for Tyson if they come back, basically, something like that,
So to answer back to your question, or the comment about the hypocrisy of agriculture, what about the hypocrisy of
I knew I got you.
8 new chicken restaurants, but we won't raise chicken here? Those are all chicken that comes out of CAFOs. So we just,
Which is why we have 8 new chicken restaurants, because of CAFOs.
And
Right.
I would just return to the idea that the language here is aspirational and not specific. I mean, at some point, how much do we need to parse the specific words when it's aspirational?
Especially because it supports state legislation. It's not regulate
right.
or, just those 3 words already say, we don't have the authority to do X or Y, but we would like to get the authority, so we're going to petition
Yeah.
through the legislative process.
And then have a discussion about what we
And
do with it.
that's where you get specific.
Yes.
I'd say we end it after harm.
Harumph.
Right?
Harumph. I agree.
I didn't know if that was agree or disagree.
Harumph.
So that's what I put forward. What do people think?
Sounds like we're putting a period there for now.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I
We
can,
can put a comma there for now, and then.
Would you like us to just put this on the
Or next
parking lot for a later discussion, and we may be able to all think on it, and, this isn't the end tonight,
Yeah,
so.
because I'm pretty sure we put a period there, or we put examples, it's gonna come back from the commission with some different
well, we'll work on some
wording.
language.
And I'm sure Jeff will be unable to resist wordsmithing this on his own in between now and the next time we meet him, so.
I think comma's good then.
These places become
Comma after.
Dot, dot, dot.
CAFOs and injection wells, that's my last plug.
We do need to address the county commission's desires on that. I'm sure we will.
We haven't had any great resolution on this.
No,
I can-
let's just bring it back later.
Okay.
And we have set aside a night to bring back kind of other open items, so.
Right. And we are otherwise finished with the chapter unless anyone has a problem with pictures and quotes, which got actually quite a bit of public comment when we had that, when people were writing in.
On one, at least. Is that
Madam
one
Chair, I
yours?
wanted
Is
to
that
go
one
on the
still there?
record that tonight, according to Arby's, I had the wild caught fish. So, and no chicken for the CAFOs.
Arby's?
Yeah, that's what they say. Fish? Wild caught for their fish sandwich. So apparently they don't put them in farms or something.
By a Russian trawler.
They could wild catch it in the
They could, I guess.
the farm
Get all
pen.
crazy and wild and stuff.
Out behind Arby's. Are we finished for the evening? Do we have any other
so.
Miscellaneous items. that
No,
need
do we
to
know what's
about?
up for mid-month?
The affordable housing, have a discussion about that one. You'll be seeing some items heading your way that'll be related to that, and also from the Affordable Housing Advisory Board will be taking a look at a text amendment that was initiated. They'll be kind of making the rounds. So that'll be it for your mid-month at this point.
All right. I would, in the
And
retail market
Possibly
study?
retail market, depending upon if we get our file from where we should get it from.
It won't be in March.
Okay.
And thank you to the 4 home viewers that are hanging with us.
I would accept a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Anybody else?
Second.
All right, all in favor? We are adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Great discussion.
We're at 4.